Our chairman for the first session, Makana Chabalala, who's president of the Soweto Chamber of Commerce and a long-standing friend of ours in the foundation, and then he will introduce our opening speaker. Let me also say that naturally we're all distressed that because of the political implications of today being May Day, most of the black delegates who had registered and would have come, probably in the order of 150 or so, are not with us. But for those of you that can communicate it, the proceedings are being recorded and will be available to delegates who are not here, of course others who aren't here. The conference yesterday and today, we were delighted to have both overwhelmingly subscribed. Today's proceedings relate more to, one could say, the macro or national issues. And yesterday, for those who weren't here, we had a full house on local government aspects of privatization. The people who are new today, I think most of the people here were not here yesterday, there being two independent conferences. The speakers who are common to both, let me just say, should not fear duplication, because there is a largely new attendance here today. And with that, a short welcome and comment, let me hand you over to Makana Chabalala.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Greater Soweto Chamber of Commerce and Industries and the Free Market Foundation, I welcome you again. We couldn't foresee the problems of today's, of the black, delegates coming through, but it has happened. So we'll take it as something that is part of the fabric of our, South African economy. I wish to introduce to you Dr. Wim de Villiers, who, instead of the minister who was supposed to give the address, the main address, he now will give the main address. Dr. Wim de Villiers.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I would like first of all to apologize for the fact that the Minister for Administration and Economic Advisory Services is prevented from opening this conference this morning. As you know, there are many matters of great national importance being attended to at Parliament at present, and which requires his presence in Cape Town. He has, however, asked me to convey to you his best wishes for a successful and fruitful conference. Your deliberations will be studied closely by his ministry, which, as you are no doubt aware, is responsible for privatization and deregulation programs in the Republic. The Minister has asked me to deputize for him, which suggestion was acceptable to the organizers of the conference, and I consider it an honor to perform this opening address this morning. The theme of the conference, namely unburdening the state, is of course very topical at present. It is not only topical, but a successful privatization program is of the utmost importance to everyone in South Africa. I have been appointed as a private sector advisor to the government on privatization, and therefore find myself in a rather difficult position. It's really a precarious position this morning. As an advisor, I cannot commit the government to a detailed policy for privatization. On the other hand, the official policy commits me to avoid expressions of opinion in my private capacity, lest it be interpreted as official policy. I will therefore attempt to find my way through this dilemma by addressing you on the more theoretical aspects of privatization. My address will be in Afrikaans. I must apologize for this. Most of the work I've done on the subject has been in Afrikaans, and I've had rather limited time to prepare this. And I hope you will get the translation in due course. Ek wil eers net die basiese verskille hanteer tussen sentrale beplanning en die vrye markbeginsels. Die eerste ekonome wat sentrale beplanning voorgestaan het beweer dat beter benutting van hulpbronne en hoër produktiwiteit in die volkshuishouding behaal kan word indien sentrale beplanning die vrye mededinging sou vervang. In wese beteken dit dat sentrale beplanning die vrywillige beplanning deur die individu moes vervang. Sentrale beplanning, soos blyk uit Hayek dit stel, vereis 'n central direction of all economic activity according to a single plan, laying down how the resources of society should be consciously directed to serve the particular ends in a definite way. Vrywillige beplanning daarenteen, deur die individu, vereis dat daar 'n rasionele permanente raamwerk moet wees waarbinne die verskillende aktiwiteite deur verskillende persone in ooreenstemming met hulle individuele planne onderneem word. Adam Smith het 'n politieke stelsel waarin die staat, die produsente en verbruikers die vryheid om te kan produseer en te verbruik soos hulle dit goed vind, voorstaan. Wat hierdie kategorieë van vrye menslike aksie ook al genoem word, vrye onderneming, vrye mark of kapitalistiese stelsel, beteken dit in wese dat mens vrylik moet kan produseer. In teenstelling met die vrye markstelsel het die vrywillige inisiatief en optrede wat op vrywillige inisiatief en optrede berus, vereis sentrale beplanning dat dwang toegepas word om die plan deur te voer. Die mate van dwang wat nodig is en die vorm wat dit aanneem, sal afhang van die mate waartoe die plan vir die individue vir wie beplan word aanvaarbaar is al dan nie. Kan julle my hoor?
Nee, ek glo nie.
Ja, daar. Is hy nou weer terug? Nee, ek twyfel.
Okay. Should I go up there? Oh, coming.
Alles reg.
Hier kom ek.
Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, 2 of our main amplifiers have gone off. I don't know what we want to do. I'm desperately battling to try and find the fault. So if you give me a few minutes, we'll be able to start in a moment.
Nou, ek sal loop.
Ja, maar probeer.
Wat ek voorstel dat ons hier verdrag voor 2 minute en sien of hulle dit kan wegkry. Want het is te grote plek om te probeer om
te praat.
So ek dink.
Ja, maar
Wat gaan ons maak nou hier?
I think let's break off for a moment.
Well,
I think we'll just, with your agreement, we'll just break off for 2 minutes, and if they've not fixed it by then we'll just have to ask.
Van die vrye markstelsel was die eerste 150 jaar van die geskiedenis van die FSA. Dit wil sê, die tydperk tot en met die Tweede Wêreldoorlog, wat basies gekenmerk is deur die toepassing van Adam Smith se benadering dat die staat die individu vrylaat om te produseer en te verbruik soos hy mag besluit. Gedurende hierdie eeu en 'n half het die nywerheidssektor van die Amerikaanse ekonomie bykans ideale vryheid van inmenging en regulasie gehad en asemrowende prestasies behaal wat voldoende was om die Verenigde State, Europa en selfs gedeeltelik die Sowjetunie in die laaste oorlog van hulle wapens te voorsien. Die vryheid waarop die vrye markstelsel berus, het gegeld tot die vroeë 30er jare in Amerika, totdat Franklin Roosevelt, soos William Simon dit stel, invented a new type of freedom, a government guarantee of economic security and prosperity. Die begrip van 'n regeringswaarborg van ekonomiese sekuriteit en welsyn het sedert die Tweede Wêreldoorlog 'n steeds groter rol in meeste kapitalistiese lande begin speel. Dit het aanleiding gegee tot groter regulering van die ekonomie, wat 'n kenmerk van die ontwikkelingsgeskiedenis van die westerse ekonomieë geword het. Na die Tweede Wêreldoorlog was die Amerikaanse model waarvolgens die vrye markstelsel gewerk het en die prestasies wat daarmee behaal is, in werklikheid 'n ideale voorbeeld vir ander westerse lande om te volg. Duitsland onder Ludwig Erhard en Japan onder Yoshida Shigeru het hierdie model ook dan met groot sukses gevolg. Ludwig Erhard het dit bereik deur die deregulasie en die verwydering van regeringskontrole om volle verloop aan die ekonomie te gee. In 'n kort aantal jare het Wes-Duitsland deur die toepassing van die vrye markstelsel Duitsland verhef tot 'n vlak wat een van die produktiefste lande in die wêreld geword het. Na die Erhard tydperk in Wes-Duitsland het sosiale demokrate steeds meer regeringsinmenging begin toepas en het die ekonomiese groeitempo aansienlik afgeneem. Sedert Japan sy naoorlogse rekonstruksie in 1953 voltooi het, is 'n ekonomiese groeikoers van gemiddeld 9,7% per jaar in die daaropvolgende 20 jaar behaal. Hierdie groeikoers was bykans dubbel die wat deur enige nywerheidsland in die naoorlogse tydperk bereik is. Die rede vir hierdie sukses is taamlik ooglopend. 'n Hoë persentasie van vaste kapitaalskepping, waarvan 'n klein persentasie in nie-produktiewe beleggings geïnvesteer is. Beperkte belastings, lae verdedigings- en regeringsbesteding, handhawing van 'n baie hoë tempo van persoonlike besparing en kanalisering van hierdie besparing op 'n doeltreffende wyse na die nywerhede deur 'n bankstelsel wat hierop ingestel is. 'n Slim wyse waarop tegnologie onder lisensie ingevoer word, 'n hoë vervangingstempo van bestaande toerusting wat moontlik is, waarna loonsverhoging beperk en produktiwiteit toegeneem het teen 'n hoër tempo as lone en die uitbreiding van die onderwys geskool op die vereistes van die nywerhede. Die uitstaande kenmerk van die Japaneese ekonomie is die raamwerk van intense mededinging op die Adam Smith model en 'n atmosfeer van toegeneentheid teenoor die privaat sektor. Terwyl Japan sedert 1945 die voorbeeld van die vrye markekonomie wat voor die Tweede Wêreldoorlog in die Verenigde State gegeld het, volg, het die Verenigde State self tot 'n groot mate van hierdie stelsel begin afwyk en 'n steeds groter wordende aandeel van die bruto nasionale produk was deur die staat hanteer. Hierdie neiging het ook in ander westerse lande ontstaan. Die Hudson Instituut van Europa het die uitwerking van hierdie neiging in 'n studie ondersoek om die verhouding tussen die toename van die owerheidssektor en die reële groei in 14 lande vas te stel. Hiervolgens het dit baie duidelik gebleik dat die ekonomiese groei die laagste was in lande waar die owerheidssektor die grootste was. Hierdie stelling word ook bevestig deur die feit dat gedurende die tydperk 1971 tot 1980 die 300 miljoen inwoners van Thailand, Maleisië, Singapore, Indonesië, die Filippyne en Taiwan, Hong Kong en Suid-Korea 'n jaarlikse gemiddelde reële ekonomiese groeikoers van tussen 6 en 11% behaal het, terwyl regeringsbesteding in die lande slegs ongeveer 15% van bruto binnelandse besteding bedraai. Vir sommige westerse lande het dit bykans dubbel hierdie persentasie beloop. Tensy 'n fundamentalistiese benadering gevolg word, wat enerzijds in of algehele staatssosialisme of anderzijds in algehele vrymarkkapitalisme glo, moet onder huidige omstandighede 'n pragmatiese benadering gevolg word, wanneer voorstelle wat die status quo versteur, oorweeg word en moet dit werklik waarneembare voordele duidelik die verwagte koste en nadelige uitwerking van 'n verandering oorskry. Dit is interessant dat 40 jaar nadat Hayek sy boek Road to Serfdom vrygestel het, daar eers in die afgelope jare in Brittanje, Amerika en ook in Suid-Afrika soveel aandag aan privatisering as 'n metode om staatsinmenging in die ekonomie te verklein en sodoende die ekonomiese prestasies te verhoog gegee word. Privatisering as sulks dan. In die breë perspektief gesien, kan die pragmatiese primêre doelwit van privatisering alleen wees om die prestasie van die ekonomie te verhoog. Privatisering moes dus die moontlikheid van die optimale benutting van hulpbronne beskikbaar in die ekonomie verhoog. In die verband stel Simmons dit as volg: Resources are scarce economic goods. When they are expended in one use, they cannot simultaneously be available for another use. Of course, resources that are wisely invested will produce greater returns than the costs. This profit can then be used to serve needs that had to be neglected before. A society's rising standard of living depends on the profitable use of resources. Kapitaal is die vernaamste hulpbron wat die doelmatige aanwending van ander beskikbare hulpbronne bepaal. In die verband maak Greenspan die volgende punt: The ultimate regulator of competition in a free society is the capital market. So long as capital is free to flow, it will tend to seek those areas which offer the maximum rate of return. Die benadering dat privatisering die prestasie van die ekonomie kan verhoog, berus dan ook op die aanname dat vrye mededinging daartoe sal lei dat kapitaalinvestering na daardie beleggings sal vloei wat die optimale opbrengs op kapitaal sal lewer. Optimale opbrengs op kapitaal kan egter ook verkry word deur die verbruiker uit te buit. 'n verdere doelwit van privatisering is egter juis om hierdie uitbuiting te verhoed deur die voordeel van laer pryse as gevolg van mededinging wat uit die werking van vrye markkragte kan voortspruit aan die verbruiker te laat kom. Daar is verskillende metodes van privatisering. Die begrip van privatisering word soms gesien as die proses waardeur die eienaarskap van staatsbesigheid en dienste ten volle of ten dele verskuif word van die staat na die privaat sektor. Feit egter is dat daar 'n veelvoud van ander maatreëls is waar volgens die beskikking oor hulpbronne in die breë verskuif kan word van die publieke na die privaat sektor. Daar word dus allerweë vandag aanvaar dat privatisering verwys na 'n breë spektrum van maatreëls wat daarop gemik is om die aandeel van die staat in die ekonomie te verklein en om die werking van vrye markkragte in die privaat sektor te bevorder deur die uitskakeling van staatsinmenging en regulasie. Daar is dus verskillende metodes van privatisering. Daar is eintlik basies 3 metodes wat geïdentifiseer word. Ten eerste is dit die deregulering ofwel liberalisering, die bevordering van mededinging of mededingende gedrag, sekere aktiwiteite wat of beperk was of statutêre monopolie of onderhewig is aan beperkte toegang. Hierdie proses bring meestal mee dat die privaat sektor 'n groter aandeel in die ekonomie verkry. Die regulering moet ook ingestel wees om die werking van vrye markkragte in die ekonomie te bevorder deur onnodige beperkings te verwyder. 'n tweede metode is die oordrag van eienaarskap van bates van die privaat sektor. Monopolie, prysringe en kartelle kan die tweede en uiters belangrike doelwit van privatisering, naamlik die voordeel van mededinging na die verbruiker, om die voordeel van mededinging na die verbruiker te laat vloei dwarsbo. In die meeste westerse ekonomieë speel hierdie tipe ondernemings 'n belangrike rol. Die vervanging van een monopolie deur 'n ander, 'n publieke sektor deur 'n privaat sektor, skep nie in sigself mededinging nie. 'n monopolie bly 'n monopolie en per definisie skakel dit mededinging uit. 'n privaat sektor monopolie is nie 'n monopolie in die kapitaalmark nie. Die privaat sektor monopolie moet winste maak wat voldoende is om sy aandeelhouers te en sy finansiers wat alternatiewe beleggingsmoontlikhede het, tevrede te stel. Die publieke sektor monopolie word hoofsaaklik met lenings wat deur die staat gewaarborg is gefinansier. Publieke sektor monopolie is gewoonlik egter nie ingestel op die opbrengs op kapitaal nie. Die geprivatiseerde monopolieonderneming het geen aansporing om voordele van laer koste aan die verbruiker deur te gee nie. Die verlaging van koste is slegs 'n metode om winsmaakgeleenthede beter te benut en te beperk die moontlikheid om 'n beter benutting van hulpbronne tot voordeel van die verbruiker te verkry. Die voordele vir die verbruiker, om voordele vir die verbruiker te verkry in 'n monopolistiese situasie, is die regering van privaat sektor monopolie dus noodsaaklik. Of andersins moet die monopolie verdeel word om mededingende eenhede te vorm. Gedeeltelike privatisering is 'n verdere alternatief en kan die vorm aanneem van die verkoop van 'n beperkte hoeveelheid aandele of die verkoop van 'n nie-essensiële aktiwiteit wat die sentrale aktiwiteit in die openbare sektor se hande laat. Die oordrag van eienaarskap word geregverdig deur die oortuiging dat die doeltreffendheid verhoog. Die verkoop van bates lewer ook inkomste wat gebruik kan word om die toenemende owerheidsbesteding te finansier en belastings laer te hou. 'n derde metode van privatisering is die aanmoediging van privaat voorsiening van dienste, tans kollektief verskaf. Hier word na twee moontlikhede gekyk, naamlik die aanmoediging van privaat voorsiening en die uitkontraktering en bedryfsuitverhuuring. Dit is belangrik om te beklemtoon dat hierdie metodes en benadering tot privatisering onafhanklik van mekaar toegepas kan word. South Africa is today facing a rather peculiar situation. I first just want to point out that whereas, apart from three periods in our history, we had an inflow of capital, that made a contribution of somewhere in the order of 20% to net national investment, fixed investment. The position today is reversed. In the period after Soweto, we also experienced an outflow of capital. And net savings in South Africa had to be applied to finance this outflow. We're today facing the same position, except that we have also got to repay loans. So we are in a position where we've got to use net savings in South Africa to finance net fixed capital investment and make some of these savings available for reducing loans overseas. Fortunately, if we look at our history, we find that the the period before 1973, we had a fairly low capital output ratio. In the period after 73, this capital output ratio has gone up considerably, which indicates that we have, in fact, in the latter period, not used the capital resources of this country properly. We have created infrastructure on a tremendous scale. We have got infrastructure available for the next period, but emphasis should undoubtedly fall on the better utilization of the available capital. The better utilization of the capital that will be available in South Africa, and sending this capital or utilizing this capital to create employment opportunities in the first instance in those sectors of our economy where we can create most employment opportunities, in farming, mining, and industries, and in the sector of our economy that has not developed properly. In this regard, South Africa has got peculiar problems. A problem of a developed first world economy and an underdeveloped, some people call it third world, I don't like the term, an underdeveloped part of our economy. We've also got the fundamental problem that the vast majority of our peoples are not partaking in a first world, in the free market economy. They're partaking as workers, but it doesn't mean to them that they're partaking in this as part of the economy. So we're facing peculiar problems. We're facing problems that I think are pretty unique. It will be interesting, and it's very interesting, and you'll hear more about it today, of the efforts that have been made in other countries. I think you'll hear about the efforts being made in America, Canada, and the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, privatization essentially means moving back to a situation before 1946, before the British government nationalized most of their industries. Deregulation has played a part, a very great part in the United States, as well as other methods of privatization. I believe in South Africa, as capital is so important, we must first look at the utilization of capital to create resources and to create employment opportunities in those sectors where we so sadly lack employment opportunities, and to make this available for our South Africans to partake in this economy. This involves a partnership between the private sector and the public sector. I believe the public sector should reduce its requirements of capital requirements as well as running costs in order to increase that sector of the South African economy where employment opportunities are really created. But this is not the end of the story. In the private sector, we have got to specifically and find ways and means of specifically moving the available capital to those areas where we can create employment opportunities and to the productive sectors of our economy. This must be a partnership between the government and private enterprise. I believe this is the duty and the responsibility of every single South African, whether he's in government or in private enterprise. Dit is nie alleen die beperkende faktore waarom ons onderwerp nie, maar dit is ook die uitdaging wat van Suid-Afrika in baie aantrekliker, baie lekkerder land sal maak om in te lewe as ons vir die toekoms deur privatisering, deur hierdie begrippe toe te pas, 'n baie gelukkiger en welvarende land vir ons kinders kan skep. Ek dank u.
Thank you, Dr. de Villiers, for the inspiring address. We really didn't miss the minister. I think we've got much more. But what is exciting is the highlights of your speech, which I find very inspiring, are your tracing of free market practices throughout since the Second World War, particularly the Malaysian, Korean, Hong Kong, and the whole Eastern exercise. But now, one of the things that seemed to come to my mind when you quoted the Hudson Institute, I remembered one very significant thing. I can't remember the head of the Hudson Institute, but he wrote a very interesting book on the next 200 years, the America and the world in the next 200 years, whatever. But he said something very significant. He says there is actually, through government intervention and socialism, or that kind of thing, there is actually a lot of food in the world. There are lots of minerals, but they are badly distributed. And this is what is causing the problem. When you quote all these practices all over the world, you find that you hardly ever notice there is a government head in the whole process. In other words, the economy is with the people and they are handling it themselves. We of the Greater Soweto Chamber of Commerce, we are acting very actively in de-racializing the economy, because it has been racialized, and we are de-racializing it. And sometimes we hear people say, those communists in capitalism, in Soweto, the black, Chamber of Commerce, and that. But we are not, because we want to make this world a better place to live for everybody, because there is a slice for everybody in this cake. Thank you again, Dr. de Villiers, for the address. I think we should give Dr. de Villiers a hand again. Unfortunately, because of the unstable situation in the townships and in the black areas, Dr. Mtswenyane has been unable to come to chair the first session of our convention here, and I think I'll take it upon myself to chair this. But before we sort out all that, I'd like to welcome particularly Mr. Willie Davis. Mr. Willie Davis, who's from America and who's done a great, a lot of work. Mr. Willie Davis, can you stand up so that we all see you? Is he? He slipped out, okay. But, all right, this happens, you see. Some people are so popular that they are very shy. But Mr. Davis has done a lot for NAFCOC and, spreading the NAFCOC word internationally. And he's collected funds for NAFCOC, spread the NAFCOC message throughout the world, especially in America. So thank you for that. To get into our first session with Dr. de Villiers, I think we sit with us. We will call on Dr. Phiri and Mr. Robert Poole, Jr. to join us. What's that? Oh, yes, I think, okay, thanks. Doctor, our first speaker, hello. Our first speaker for the morning is Dr. Medson Piri. Dr. Medson Piri is the president of the Adam Smith Institute, and is an architect of Margaret Thatcher's privatization program. He was, I think, properly introduced yesterday twice or three times, and he loves it, I think. He lives in London. He's got an MA in philosophy and history from Edinburgh University, and a PhD philosophy at St. Andrews. In 1974, he was a research associate Republican studying. He was in America at this study committee in the USA. I'm sorry. We'll call on Dr. Medson Piri. Give us our first paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to deal with the British record on privatisation, and my story begins in Cambridge, the University of Cambridge. My colleague, I should say, Dr. Butler, the director of the Adam Smith Institute, bought a house in Cambridge, just outside London, thinking that in the event of a nuclear war, the Russians would hardly be likely to hit so many of their own people. He was visiting his old university recently, and in the room of his economics professor, he noticed on the desk the final examination paper for honours MA economics in Cambridge this year, and he couldn't help noticing that all of the questions were exactly the same as he had taken 10 years earlier. And he drew the attention of his professor to the fact that every single question was identical. And the professor said, well, that's all right. You see, we've changed all the answers. I intend to show you why all the answers have changed in Britain in these last few years. I would ask you to cast your mind back, if you will, to the dawn of time, to prehistory itself, that is Britain before Mrs. Thatcher, and consider a typical day in the life. One would wake up to the strains of the state radio broadcast. One would go downstairs and with a British steel knife cut into one's egg marketing board breakfast, with one's state dairy milk perhaps, going to one's British Leyland state-produced car, saying hello to the state mailman as he delivered last week's mail, pausing to exchange cheery greetings with the state refuse collector as he spilled trash on the street, maybe dropping one's spouse off at a state health clinic, one's children to state school, and one would catch a state railway to one's job in the state sector, of course. Maybe during a typical day you'd pick up the state telephone system, phone the state airline and book a flight with the state travel firm on a state aeroplane. You begin to get the picture of Britain in 1979. It was possible to go through a typical day, indeed a typical life, without at any point contacting the private enterprise wealth-producing sector of the economy. Not surprisingly, we had problems. Well, the record since then, very quickly, is that in every single one of those areas I have mentioned in that day in the life, there is now choice and opportunity for private enterprise opened up. In every single one of those areas I have mentioned, that same individual would now have choice and would face the private sector at several points in the day. So we ask ourselves, how did this come about? Well, the answer is it came about by accident. Mrs. Thatcher in 1979 came in with a fairly traditional conservative program. The conservative governments come to office throughout the world with a program that they are intending to cut the costs of government. They are going to make government more efficient by bringing in expertise from the private sector. And finally, they're going to eliminate unnecessary programs from the public sector. These are the traditional conservative policies, and Mrs. Thatcher achieved the traditional conservative result, namely failure. The point being, of course, that when you try to cut the costs of government, and in Britain this policy was called cash limits, you assume that by cutting its budget you can force the public sector to be more efficient. You think that they will eliminate wastage and office expenses, and that the thing will become very much more cost-effective. Wrong. The programs for making economies which the bureaucrats put forward have a remorseless similarity about them. On day one, they close down a school for crippled children. On day two, they throw the old people out onto the streets. On day three, maybe the hate mail starts to arrive, and on day four, the legislators think this economy campaign is not such a good idea after all. We never yet in Britain, it may be different in South Africa, we never yet in Britain met a bureaucrat who came forward and said, well, my job is unnecessary for a start, you can halve my salary. There are great savings to be made in administrative wastage in my department. It doesn't happen in Britain. The second method, it's a sort of cyclical game we play in Britain. We bring in an expert from the private sector, someone who's made a name, taking some company to the top of the tree. And he or she does a report on the public sector, pointing out where private sector business methods, bulk buying, office amalgamations, can be introduced. And the civil servants, I'll wait until this has been adjusted. Right, Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow.
We're back in business,
okay.
by the way.
We've got this one working again. Excellent. Thank you very much. Good heavens. I think someone should privatize this microphone before we go. This game we play, the city whiz kid, the expert from private business, makes the recommendations, and at this point the civil servants hold their breath for about 3 months and then heave a huge sigh of relief and close the file cabinet again for another 2 years. Oh, they agree to use the paper clips twice just to show they are willing to use private sector methods. The point being, of course, that the public sector does not face the pressures of the private sector. It does not have the competitive spur, it does not have the need to operate economically, it cannot go bankrupt if it falls by the wayside, and so none of the pressures which make the private sector efficient work at all on the public sector. And so finally we come to the method 3, eliminating unnecessary programs. And here the problem is that in the public sector there simply are no unnecessary programs. Everything the public sector does is absolutely vital. And if you attempt to cut out any program as unnecessary, you will soon find it is highly necessary to the bureaucrats who administer it, to the workforce who gain their livelihood from it, and to that part of the public which receives its benefit. In the whole of the British public sector, we did not find a single program which was unnecessary. As a matter of fact, we did find one. There was, in 1812, we appointed a gentleman to sit on the white cliffs of Dover with a telescope in his hand and watch for the French fleet. And his job was to light a bonfire when he saw Napoleon's ships. And so by a means of a signal relay, the information would be conveyed to the Admiralty in London. This post was abolished in 1946, by which time the danger had somewhat diminished. And it shows that while you can in principle hope to abolish unnecessary programs, you must be prepared to spend some time on the exercise. So the 3 traditional methods very simply achieved the traditional result. Now, I'm reminded here of the motto of the Boy Scouts in Britain. It may be the same over here. They have a little poem which says, "They said this thing could not be done. With a smile, he told them he knew it, so he tackled this thing that couldn't be done." And he couldn't do it. Well, in Britain, we elect conservative governments occasionally, and they try to control the public sector, and they fail. And then we say, well, we obviously weren't tough enough, we must elect someone tougher next time. And so next time they elect someone tougher, and they try, and they fail, and then everyone says we must elect someone tougher who will do it faster and quicker and stronger and sooner. And eventually you reach Mrs. Thatcher. Now, Mrs. Thatcher is the end of the road because there isn't anyone tougher than Mrs. Thatcher. And by the time you've elected Mrs. Thatcher and she can't do it, you begin to suspect that that is because it cannot be done. It's a good working rule of thumb that if Mrs. Thatcher can't do it, it can't be done. And so we come to the view that in fact it is impossible to control the public sector. by any of the traditional methods. The forces which sustain it, the interest groups which draw their livelihood from it, are too strong for the political process to surmount. And legislators simply are incapable politically of exerting pressure to counterbalance the forces that the interest groups, the managers in the civil service, the workforce, and the public beneficiaries can all exert too strong a pressure through the political process for a democracy to control its public sector. And we came to that conclusion in 1979 and therefore tried the alternative tactic. And that is, if you can't control it, you can at least get rid of it. And we discovered that there are parts of the public sector that you can simply sell. And the privatization program was born when we started to sell them. We sold firms like Amersham, which handled Britain's radionics industry, the use of radioactive chemicals in medicine. And it was a very successful sale. We discovered that if something is economically viable and shows a return, then it is possible to sell it in a very straightforward way on the stock market. Unfortunately, it is not in the nature of the public sector that most of its activities are economically viable. Indeed, many of the things in the public sector are only there because they were not economically viable, and any that were rapidly cease to be so once they're in the public sector. So the number of things you can sell is really very small. But we discovered that you can sometimes part sell, that if you can't sell the whole of it, perhaps you can sell enough of it to put it into the private sector. In Britain, if you can sell 51% of an operation, it counts thereafter as a private sector company, and any capital it raises is no longer part of public borrowing or national debt. And we discovered with firms like British Aerospace that if the government retains 49%, people are reassured by the size of that holding and encouraged to buy the firm. And so we sold 51% to British Aerospace. Now, one advantage of this is you make very much less of a claim on the capital market if you're only selling half of it. There is another advantage, in that once the thing has gone into the private sector, it starts behaving economically, competitively, it becomes efficient, its value rises, the price of the shares goes up, and then quietly you unload the other 49%, that's an enormous profit. So we discovered that many firms which you cannot sell outright, you can at least sell a proportion of the shares of. Our third discovery was that even for government operations which you cannot either sell or sell a part of the equity, you can sell distinct pieces and sections of. There are parts of the public sector which can be broken off and sold as separate entities. For example, we could not, and still cannot, sell British Leyland, the enormous conglomerate which handles our automotive industry in Britain. But we have managed to sell Jaguar cars, and we are selling this summer Unipart, the spare parts shops. We are selling Rolls-Royce. We sell pieces of it. We even tried, as you probably read, we're in the process of selling Land Rover and British Leyland trucks. And it is significant that the privatization debate in Britain has now advanced so far that the big political row was whether Land Rover should be sold to the Americans or, as the Labour Party urged instead, sold to the British. Absolutely no one at all in that argument suggested that the state should retain control of it. Privatization has now gone to the stage where the argument is about how you sell and who you sell it to. The question of whether you sell at all has been answered long ago. So we have here three distinct methods of privatization. That is selling part of the equity or selling distinct sections, all of which have been practiced extensively in Britain since 1980. And a major part of the companies which have made big news in foreign press, companies like Telecom and so on, have been disposed of by one of those three methods. But we do not stop there. And if the thing cannot be sold, cannot be part sold, and if no pieces of it can be sold, we can still sell it to the workforce. And in the case of our National Freight Corporation, that is precisely what we did. The management and workforce of National Freight pooled their savings, mortgaged their homes, and bought the company themselves. And it has proved a great success. They have all made more than 1,000% on their investment in 3.5 years. They've multiplied tenfold the value of their investment. It also has the liveliest shareholders meeting of any company in Britain, largely because every single shareholder works for the company and knows how it's run. And we've done that with several of the docks. And it's one where we're using increasingly now. The creation of a management workforce cooperative to take over and handle in the private sector that which was an unprofitable or failing public entity. Well, you might think that if we can't sell part of it, sell pieces of it, or sell it to the workforce, that we'd be beaten. But no, if we can't do that, we give it away. And in the case of the hovercraft cross-channel services, we simply gave that one to the workforce. The thing was losing so much money that there was no way it had any value whatsoever. No one would buy it. So we called in the management and workforce and handed over the title deeds, and it became a private corporation from that day. And they are running it in an economically viable way. It's still there. It's still at least breaking even. They're doing things that weren't possible in the state sector. It's amazing how people's habits change once they're working for themselves. We discovered this in National Freight Corporation. They used to spend a lot of time arguing about who does what job. And now they spend their time arguing about how fast they can make money. It's a subtle change once they become the owners. Well, if you can't do any of those methods, I mean, we have so far used 22 different methods. It may even be 23. I've been away 3 days. I'm not going to detail them all, but I'm giving you something of the flavour of what we've done. Sometimes it is sufficient to repeal the monopoly and allow growth in the private sector of a competing service. We did this with the National Bus Company. We repealed its monopoly on long-distance intercity routes. The National Bus Company was losing money and it was quite impossible to sell it. But the repeal of the monopoly led to the entry in our long-distance bus service of the private operators. And they immediately cut fares to 1/3 in some cases. They introduced vending machines in buses selling coffee and newspapers. They introduced video machines for long journeys. And of course, they immediately attracted a high proportion of the trade. Incidentally, some of them were prosecuted for showing pornographic videos on their buses, and their sales went up immediately. Which probably says a lot about British travellers. The interesting feature of that particular piece of privatisation was the response of the National Bus Company. It responded to the competition by cutting its own fares and bringing in its own service innovations, and it captured a lot of trade back. And the result is that here we are 3 years later, 3.5 years later, and the National Bus Company is making money. And now we're going to sell it. It's being privatised this summer. Where are we? Sometimes we repeal the monopoly. Sometimes we keep the finance in the public sector and use private contractors to perform public services. And they must bid competitively for the contract. This has been the pattern throughout local government. We started privatising refuse collection services, then street sweeping, maintenance of recreation centres, parks and gardens, cleaning of windows, catering and cleaning for public buildings, schools, hospitals, then the professional services, architects, lawyers, town planners, the use of contract private business, in some cases turning the local government department itself into a private business and giving it the first contract for 3 years to launch it on its way has proved successful. We use contractors now to maintain military bases, to procure and maintain military equipment. The use of specialists from the private sector has proved very much more efficient. And consider, for example, the British Army. We take a soldier, train him for 2 years, make him a skilled professional, and then use him to cut the grass on the general's lawn. This is not a terribly efficient use of manpower. Far better to hire in private firms of grass cutters. They're very much less expensive. They're trained to cut grass. Sometimes, as well as using contractors, for the more politically sensitive areas, such as health and education, we use the principle of encouraging exit from the state sector. And in the case of the National Health Service, enormously valued by the British people, despite all its failings. They like the security which it provides. And we promote privatisation there by giving people an incentive to seek private health insurance instead. We give them a small tax advantage. If their employer puts them into a private health scheme, it's treated as a non-taxable part of salary. And so there's an incentive for them to opt for private medicine. And we have seen an accelerated growth of private medicine. In 1979, it was the sort of thing that company directors did. Now there are 800,000 trade unionists enrolled in private medical schemes, civil servants, engineers, electricians. And for the first time last year, the expenditure on private medicine in Britain topped £1 billion, as opposed to the spending of 17 billion on the National Health Service. But the private sector is climbing very rapidly as people are effectively privatising it themselves. Their own decisions over the months and years accumulate to produce that result. So the scale of privatisation in Britain is such that the proportion of state industry, of industry in the hands of the public sector was 10.5%. It's now down to just over 6%. That's the scale of the reduction we've achieved so far. More than all of that added together has been our success in disposing of the state houses. 929,000 as of Monday. It will be 1 million by September. Houses which were owned by the state have now been bought by the people who live in them. And the formula there was to offer them, instead of the subsidised rent they were paying, was to offer them discounts off the market price, starting at 20% and rising up to 50% off the market valuation. That's now been increased to 70% as we try and accelerate the pace of sales. And we've also just extended the law so that it applies to flats and apartments as well as actual houses. And so we're going to see that figure increasing. But the total value of all that, £12.2 billion of those houses, is more than all of the industries and utilities that I've mentioned added together in terms of the gross yield by government. And that's the sort of unsung success story. Let me give you a fairly typical case to show you how it's done. When we privatised British Telecom, we faced the potential opposition of the management, and we allowed the management to take it into the private sector to become the new board of directors of the private company. For much as they enjoyed the power and prestige of running a major nationalised industry, they enjoy even more the prospect of being the board of directors of a highly profitable and successful private company. So we secured their acquiescence and support, and they in fact handled the transfer for us. So we didn't face opposition from the administration of Telecom. The workforce were told by the unions to take strike action to hold fast for the principle of public ownership. We offered them shares in Telecom. 8.6% of the shares were allocated for the workforce, and given a choice between principle on the one hand and the shares on the other, 92% took the money. So they are now part owners of Telecom. They have a piece of the action, and their fortunes and rewards ride with the success of Telecom. They no longer feel mere employees. It's now their company. The general public, some of them were alarmed at the prospect of their telephone service going private. So we gave them reductions on their phone bills for 3 years if they bought the shares. We arranged for the purchase of the shares to be done by credit sales, stretching over 2 years. To buy shares in Telecom, you only had to pay 50 pence down for each share, and the rest was paid over 2 years. The result was that we had 2 million people buying the shares in Telecom. It's the largest company ever floated on the stock market, and the most diverse share ownership we've ever achieved. And 2/3 of those chose to retain them. We also allocated the shares in such a way that only the small applicants were satisfied. This, first of all, spread the ownership of the shares very widely, and secondly, it meant that people who wanted to buy shares as part of an investment portfolio, the big funds, had to buy them on the open market, and guess what that did to the price of the little man's shares? People made a profit of roughly 100% on the first day. So it was very popular with the public as well. There were concerns as to whether Telecom as a private company would continue to operate the unprofitable payphones in remote rural areas, so we wrote it into the bill that they had to. There were concerns as to what might happen to the price once it was private, so we wrote controls over prices into the bill. People knew what they were buying. They were buying a private company subject to legal controls, which were written in advance. We dealt with every single conceivable objection that anyone could have raised to the privatisation of Telecom and put it into the Act. For example, what happens if foreigners buy this vital strategic industry? Answer, the British government retains 1 golden share, and in the event of control passing into foreign hands, that 1 golden share is activated, giving the British government voting control. We dealt with every conceivable objection. Not surprisingly, the privatisation of Telecom was a huge success. It was the largest to date, and we satisfied not only the management, the workforce, and the general public, but that fourth interest group, the legislators. And the ones who put it through gained enormously in popularity, and they'll come back for more. When we privatise British Gas this summer, it will be twice the size of Telecom. When we privatise the water authorities the year after, that will be twice the size of British Gas. We are increasing privatisation in Britain at the rate of 50% more every single year. When you try to cut the costs of government and to control its spending, you run out of steam fairly rapidly. You do the easy ones first, and then after 6 months you try and do a few others, but the pressures build up against you as the interest groups oppose the cutting of their services. And after a year, the thing is all over. Not so with privatisation. It is increasing exponentially and shows no signs of slackening in its pace. We have privatised welfare services in some counties, the care of old people, juvenile delinquents. We are beginning to experiment with privatisation of prisons. We have privatised the lavatories at King's Cross railway station. British Petroleum, British Aerospace, British Oil, Cable and Wireless, Enterprise Oil, Jaguar, the docks, the ports, the shipyards, the munitions. Coming this summer, we have the British Airports Authority, including the function of air traffic control. We have coming Rolls-Royce Engineering, Unipart from British Leyland, British Gas, as I mentioned. We have the British Rail Property Board, the Royal Naval Dockyards coming, and sometime this year, British Airways. That's just this summer's crop. I mean, that's, the immediate short term. Next year, we have coming the water authorities and the electricity boards, and after that, down the road, we have the post office. The total value to the government of the sales at the moment. I'm not counting the fact that they no longer have to subsidise these operations. I'm not counting the fact that these private companies start making profits and pay taxes. I'm just talking about the sales revenue is now running at £4.75 billion per year, increasing at 50% per annum. Already the equivalent of 4% on tax. In March, the government in its budget lowered basic taxation from 30 to 29. Without privatisation, it would already be 33. You see, the government is hooked on privatisation, rather like heroin. They have to take a bigger dose each year to get the same thrill. Labour policy is quite interesting to watch. They originally were going to take back the shares in Telecom, and then 2 million people bought them, and the Labour Party now says it's not going to take back the shares from the small shareholders. They were originally going to take back the houses. 1 million people bought them, and the Labour policy is now not only not to take them back, they unveiled their new policy in January, which is called the right to buy. Yes, they're going to continue the discounted sales. In other words, the whole centre of gravity of the political spectrum is being moved towards the private sector. People say, what would happen if Mrs. Thatcher were run over by a bus? Well, first of all, no bus would dare. But even if Colonel Gaddafi were driving one and he got lucky, still the answer is that privatisation would not be reversed. There are too many interest groups now locked into it, and it would probably continue, albeit at a slower pace. The British public sector, Norman Tebbit, our Conservative Party chairman, said the British public sector in 1979 was the largest of any advanced economy, and he promised that by the 1990s it would be the smallest. And we are well on target at the moment. The rest of the world, of course, is privatising. We heard mention of the Philippines, Korea, Thailand, Indonesia. You can also add the countries of Europe and Canada, America at the local government level. We in Britain are developing quite some expertise. We've been at it 7 years, and we all have hopes that when we finished in Britain and the last piece is finally sold off, that we'll all get jobs abroad advising other governments about how to do it, for a fee, of course. And Mrs. Thatcher were prepared to contract out on a one-year basis. The lesson we learn, first of all, you must deal systematically with all of the interest groups involved. You must make your privatisation policy give them more benefit than they enjoyed from the state system. Every single case is different. It is even more true that every country is different. The methods we have used in Britain will not work over here. You will have to find your own equivalent different methods. But one thing is true, and that is that the principles will be the same. The principles of identifying potential opposition, identifying public sector interest groups, and framing your privatization policy so it deals systematically with those objections. Well, how long can we go on doing it in Britain? What is there left? Well, I think there's enough to keep me busy for the rest of my lifetime. The public sector is so big that there's room for everyone to privatise their own little bit of it. By the time we get near the end of the road, I will be safely and quietly dead. And by then, I think Britain will have a public sector which is so small and plays so inconsequential a part in the lives of its citizens that as far as the government of Britain is concerned, it'll no longer matter who's in charge of it.
I think 10 questions. 10 minutes questions. Thank you, Dr. Piri. It does look like the principles are the same, and we will try to raise some money and employ you as a consultant to start privatization, particularly if when one looks at the whole spectrum of the things that have to be privatized. You still have a lot to do for us, and we just implore you not to die not to die early, and to keep alive for another lifetime, and we'll use you. Question time will come after Mr. Poole's speech. Just to introduce Mr. Poole Jr. Bob Poole is president of the Reason Foundation and of Local Government Center in the USA. He is the author of many articles and papers and books, and is regarded as a leading expert on privatization. I think he was also properly and adequately introduced yesterday. I won't waste time on that introduction. Bob, you come up, give him a hand, please. Sorry, there's a message for Mr. Humans, Mr. C. Human. There's a message for him at the reception desk. Thanks, Bob. Mr. Move there.
I think it's all right.
Okay.
I'd like to tell you about privatization in the United States. I wish that I could report the same kind of success stories at the national government level that Madsen Piri has just told us about having occurred in Britain. Unfortunately, we have not had that kind of a track record at the national government level. There's been a great deal of talk about privatization of national government functions, particularly in the last 3 or 4 months. But so far there's been very little action. There has been, however, a great deal of activity, a huge record of progress and achievement at the local government level, which those of you who were here yesterday heard a great deal about. I think probably the United States is the leading country in the world, without question, in privatizing local government services. Let me give you just a very quick recap of that record first to set the stage for the benefit of those who weren't here yesterday. In the United States, there has been, over the last decade, great deal of pressure on local governments to not raise taxes and to control their spending, and that has provided a powerful motivation for them to look at lower cost ways of providing services. And because privatization, for all the reasons that Madsen Piri talked about, promotes efficiency, promotes the discipline of the marketplace, it generally and decisively leads to lower costs, typically 20 to 40% lower costs for getting the same job done. And so as a result, we have had successive waves of privatization at the local government level. Basically on a trial and error basis, not with any overall master plan. It has simply been a response that more and more local authorities have learned about. They've learned from others. And a few organizations such as my own local government center have played a role as a catalyst in helping spread the information around. The first wave of privatization was of local government's own housekeeping functions, things such as cutting the grass in parks and along public streets, janitorial services in public buildings, maintaining the vehicle fleets that local governments have, police cars, garbage trucks, whatever, running computer centers for local government, and providing specialized services like prison medical care or city engineering or legal services. And this has been done primarily by contracting out, by going out to tender on a competitive basis and picking the lowest cost qualified bidder to do the job. Now that's been going on for 10 or 15 years and at an increasing pace. The second stage of local authority privatization has been services delivered directly to the public, things such as refuse collection and disposal, emergency ambulance service, in a few cases fire protection and a few specialized police services, and a number of healthcare and social services, programs for delinquent youths, daycare centers for children, these sorts of things. And again, most of these have been done by contracting out, although in some cases they've been handled by giving vouchers to the potential recipients of the services and allowing people to cash in those vouchers with any available service provider, again introducing competition by means of that process. The most recent stage of local authority privatization has been large-scale projects to build and operate infrastructure, and we've seen consortiums of firms, financing firms such as investment banking houses, engineering and consulting firms and construction firms, putting together deals to build public hospitals, wastewater treatment plants, refuse recycling plants, plants that burn garbage and produce energy, and even in the last couple of years, prisons. And this seems to be the newest trend in America of getting together an industry team that raises the money, designs the project, builds it, and operates it on about a 20 or 25-year contract, at which time the title may or may not revert to the local authority. And over the course of all of this 10 or 15 years of privatization, we've had many studies done, some of them on a nationwide basis, and they've confirmed that privatization works, that it generally saves 20 to 40%, sometimes 50 and 60%, that it often results in innovations and new forms of service delivery because of the competitive nature of the business. The firms have to think up new and better ways of operating in order to satisfy their customers so the customers don't go elsewhere. So and the perception now has grown. It's widely reported in articles in popular magazines, in journals read by professionals in government, that when you substitute competition for monopoly, when you use market pricing to price these different services rather than just providing them free based on tax revenues, and when you have profit incentives working to motivate the people who deliver services rather than simply the bureaucratic incentives of government, you generally get lower costs, innovation, and better service quality. So these lessons have been learned, they're widely acknowledged, and yet at the national government level, despite 5.5 years of probably the most free enterprise-oriented president that the United States has had in many a decade, we've seen very little happen at the national government level. Well, let me explain what's been tried and talk a little bit about what we can learn from that. In Ronald Reagan's first term, the interest in privatization occurred within a group called the President's Council of Economic Advisors. This consists of 3 leading economists who are appointed by the president, who have a staff of about 25 young economists who do various studies and make recommendations for national policy to the president and the president's cabinet. And the Council of Economic Advisors got interested in several areas of privatization, primarily in order to generate some revenue to reduce budget deficits. One that they looked at, got very excited about in the first year of Reagan's term, 1981, was selling public lands. Now, many of you in South Africa may not realize that although the United States is supposed to be this great free enterprise-oriented country and hardly a socialist government, The national government owns 1/3 of the land area of the United States, 1/3 of the whole country. Much of this land is either unused or very badly managed. Some of it's commercial timberland, which is operated very economically. The government manages to lose about $1 billion a year on its commercial timber operations. It leases out grazing land at about 1/4 of the price that next door privately owned grazing land is leased for, similar sorts of things. So the economists made some studies and made a case for this and said, we ought to start systematically selling off some of this government land and raise a lot of revenue and make it more efficient in the private sector. Well, what happened was that, first of all, the president didn't really get behind this. He endorsed it in a lukewarm manner and told the Secretary of the Interior Department, James Watt, whom some of you may have heard of, to go forward with a plan to start disposing of what they called surplus land. And that was a big mistake to begin with, because who defines surplus? Well, they turned to the bureaucrats who manage the lands and said, tell us which of your lands are surplus. How many bureaucrats say part of their empire is surplus or unnecessary? Well, very, very little, very few. And so they came up with practically nothing. Secondly, the environmental organizations, which have a great popularity with the press and millions of members, saw that they, to the extent that public lands were sold to private owners, those environmental organizations would not have much influence anymore on how those lands were managed. So they cranked up a huge publicity campaign saying that our national heritage was to be destroyed and given over to greedy, profit-hungry people. And so very quickly, lacking the support of the government bureaucrats, lacking a real commitment by the president, the whole thing just petered out after about a year of talk. The second initiative from the Council of Economic Advisors was to sell satellites that do the weather forecasting and the so-called Landsat program that makes maps from space that look for mineral deposits and this sort of thing. Unfortunately, this particular proposal originated with a private company, the ComSat Corporation, and this fact quickly was leaked to the press that the idea had been proposed by ComSat Corporation. Their idea was that here was an opportunity, it was a natural extension of their existing business of launching communication satellites. The weather satellites were money losers, were money makers, because the government has a monopoly on doing weather forecasts, and so they need to keep buying the information. Whereas the Landsats were money losers, but they eventually were thought to have a commercial future. So ComSat's idea was sell the two sets of satellites as a package. The profits from one will subsidize the losses from the other, and gradually will commercialize the whole thing. The Council of Economic Advisors liked the idea of getting these things out of government, and they thought so it was a good idea. But again, political considerations of this having been proposed by a large private profitable company made it very vulnerable to being attacked as some kind of a special deal for this one company, and had a big fight in Congress. Finally, what was decided, very reluctantly, Congress allowed the money-losing Landsat satellites to be privatized with 5 years of government subsidy for the operator, but kept the weather satellites as part of the government. And so that was not a very successful enterprise either. The third proposal, which has actually gone further, is the nationalized freight railroad in the northeastern part of the United States called Conrail. Now, most railroads, all but that railroad in the United States, are private enterprises and are basically profit-making. But in the Northeast, several railroads were merged about 10 years ago in a very disastrous manner and soon went bankrupt. And Congress nationalized those railroads because they decided that it was essential that a single freight railroad continue to serve the Northeast. The government has put $7.6 billion of our tax money into Conrail to try to rehabilitate it, rebuild all the track, modernize the equipment. They fortunately appointed experienced railroad people to run it, and it has now, for several years, managed to turn a pretty good profit the last several years. So about 2 years ago, the administration decided it was time to privatize Conrail, to get it back out of government. And Unfortunately, they did not look at what was happening in Britain. They did not even consider the idea of getting the management and the employees involved in any sort of a privatization proposal. They instead decided to simply find a large industrial company to make a bid for it and sell it to an existing major firm. They initially got about 20 bids. They narrowed it down to 3 and picked what they considered the best one. It's a very low bid, only $1.4 billion, despite the fact that $7.6 billion of taxpayers' money has gone into it over the last 6 years. So it's become very controversial. People say this is a giveaway. It's not a good thing to allow this company to take for such a low price. And congressmen responding to special interest groups have tried to attach all sorts of conditions to the sale that would make it much less economically viable. The bill to privatize Conrail has finally, a month ago, been approved by the Senate, but has a long, tough fight ahead in the House of Representatives, and we're not sure really what's going to happen, whether it will or won't be privatized this year. So that so far is the record of privatization in Reagan's first term. Now, once Reagan was reelected at the end of 1984, a number of us in the think tank business in America got very concerned about whether there was really going to be any serious privatization or not. And several of us got together with the Reagan administration, with White House policymakers last summer. We held a 2-day session on privatization with some top policymakers, and in particular we showed a half-an-hour film summarizing the points about British success with privatization that Madsen Puri just explained to us this morning. And we made a very positive impression. We got a number of those people convinced that privatization, if done correctly, could be politically very successful, and it could be something that could generate a great deal of revenue. And as you know, we have a continuing problem with very large continuing budget deficits, $200 billion a year in the United States. And so the idea of both gaining political points and raising a lot of revenue turned out to be very attractive. The administration set up a working group on privatization headed by one of the members of the Council of Economic Advisors. And in January of this year, President Reagan, in his budget message, announced a major commitment to privatizing federal assets and programs, naming initially 4 targets: the Federal Power Marketing Administrations, which are electricity sales companies that sell electricity from large government hydroelectric projects; Amtrak, the nationalized passenger railroad service; the Washington, D.C. airports, which are owned by the federal national government; and the Federal Housing Administration, which is a mortgage insurance operation that has many private sector counterparts. They've also issued a few trial balloons about selling the Postal Service. Now, so far, none of these measures have gotten anywhere, but we in the policy community have high hopes of moving those issues along. Now, what I'd like to talk about a little bit now is my own assessment of why we haven't seen more movement, why these proposals have only now, after 5 years of Ronald Reagan, come onto the political agenda, and why they may not even go through despite a presidential commitment to them. First of all, in contrast to the local government level, the national government in the United States has no requirement to have a balanced budget. So that means spending to the politicians is far more important than revenues. And there is not the kind of pressure that has existed at the local government level to keep spending and revenues in balance and to use privatization as a means of economizing. Secondly, in contrast to Britain, which has a parliamentary system, in the United States, we can have a president of one party and a Congress, in our case the House of Representatives, controlled by an opposite party, which has no commitment whatever to the president's agenda. And so whereas Margaret Thatcher can say, this is our program for privatization, we're going to do this, 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 and this, and she has almost automatically a majority that can carry it out, we don't have anything like that situation in our sort of representational system of Congress. Interest groups, therefore, are extremely powerful in influencing members of Congress to vote to continue federal benefits for some at the expense of everyone else. Third, very important reason, and you may share this perception, is that the perception is widespread among Americans that, in contrast to Britain, France, Germany, and other parts of the world, we in the United States, because we've never had a socialist government, we've never had major nationalizations, we don't have anything much to privatize. Our public sector is very small, very lean. In fact, that's grossly incorrect. As I mentioned, 1/3 of the land area alone is owned by our national government, and you may have heard of something called the Grace Commission. Peter Grace, one of America's leading industrialists, the head of W.R. Grace and Company, was appointed by the president 3 years ago to head a commission of business leaders to study waste and inefficiency in the federal government, the kind of thing that Madsen Puri talked about. The Grace Commission did a wonderful job of pointing out what a huge, awkward commercial enterprise the federal government actually is. It's the largest, not only the largest landowner, it's the largest employer in the United States, it's the largest insurer, the largest borrower of money, the largest lender of money, the largest tenant of leased property, and the largest landlord with huge public housing programs. And yet, for all this good work of identifying all these commercial enterprises that the government is involved in and does a very poor job at, the Grace Commission failed when it came to recommendations. They said, we can save $400 billion a year by doing things more efficiently, by running the government like a business. But, totally ignoring the fact that there's no reason whatever to expect government to run like a business. Government does not have the competitive pressures of the marketplace that a business has. Government will survive regardless of whether it runs like a business, so there's no reason for government managers to behave that way. The only way to get government to behave like a business is to take those functions and put them into the marketplace as businesses, privatization. But the Grace Commission, unfortunately, being composed primarily of well-meaning business leaders, but not of economists and public policy experts, simply didn't understand why government can't and won't function as a business. The fourth and probably most important reason that privatization has not advanced very far at the national level is one that Dr. Puri mentioned also, that the rhetorical focus of discussing privatization has not been in the correct place. The focus has been, and some of us have contributed to this initially, the focus has been on budget cutting, on cutting the cost of government, on raising revenues. And now what this has enabled people to do who criticize privatization is to portray those of us who promote privatization as people who want to, by cutting revenues, by cutting costs in the government, they portray privatization as a taking things away from people. If you privatize something out of government, they say you're talking about abolishing it. You're taking benefits away from people. And so they can portray the issue to the media as good guys who want to keep things in government, thereby keeping benefits for people, versus bad guys who want to take things away from government, meaning taking things away from people. Now, who's going to win and who's going to lose in that kind of a contest? It's pretty obvious. If the issue is portrayed that way, who's going to be the winner? But the lesson is you can't beat a something with nothing. Government programs all have beneficiaries. They're delivering things to people. It's a something. You have to, in selling privatization, you have to explain to people that privatization does not mean taking away. It means putting assets and enterprises in better hands, in the hands of people who are responsive to the marketplace, who respond to the needs of consumers, who get feedback, who have to deliver a good service, a good value for the money, or people can go elsewhere and get a better deal somewhere else. It's that kind of lesson that we need to learn if we're going to be able to sell privatization successfully. And we need to tell the story agency by agency of what it is that would be better if, for example, airports were run by private enterprise and could charge enough money to have the revenues available to build the new runways that they need, to build the parking garages that they need, to keep them functioning in order to meet the needs of consumers adequately. We need to show that technological innovations that just seem to be not handled by the public sector are readily introduced in the private sector. Everyone in America complains about the poor quality of postal service. They're backward, they're inefficient. They tried to start using electronic mail as a supplement to sending letters. They totally screwed it up. They made a disastrous failure out of it, and everybody clucked and said, well, that's government. And yet, if we privatized the Postal Service, subjected it to the discipline of the marketplace, there's a much greater chance that new technologies like electronic mail would be used effectively and properly. The competitors in overnight priority delivery like DHL and Federal Express, they have used, in America, they put little computer terminals in their delivery and pickup trucks so that they can get last-minute notifications of where a package needs to be picked up. It has never occurred to the Postal Service to do that. There's no incentive on the part of their managers to think of that kind of innovations. So finally, what we need to do is to develop the kind of political strategies, again, that have been perfected so well in Britain, to identify who would stand to gain from privatization. There are always potential obvious beneficiaries, people who would provide the services in a competitive marketplace, and people who would immediately stand to benefit from better mail delivery, a better air traffic control system, whatever it might be that government is now doing badly, that the users could benefit from having more competent, advanced, innovative, and responsive service. And then identify who might lose from privatization and figure out ways of compensating them, giving them shares of stock, making them part owners, whatever it might be. So to sum up, there's tremendous potential for privatization in the United States at the national government level. We could do just as much there as we've done at the local government level, but so far we haven't done our homework in the same way that the British have. We need to learn how to design specific plans for privatization on a case-by-case basis. We need to learn how to build coalitions of potential beneficiaries and providers. And above all, we need to change the focus of arguing for privatization away from cost-cutting and revenue maximization and towards the benefits of having services provided competitively in the marketplace instead of by unresponsive government bureaucratic monopolies. Those are lessons I think that could be learned and profited from in South Africa as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. We now have 9 minutes. 9 minutes for questions, but I want to mention one thing that Bob and Dr. Phiri recently were giving talks on privatization international at an international conference on privatization in Washington. So the experiences and the concepts and the way the British and the American way of privatization seems to complement each other, and I think somewhere in between we will find ourselves slotted in nicely. Thank you again, Bob. I will call on questions. We now have 8 minutes. Any questions? Oh, by the way, somebody says I must give people until 8:15. That means we now have 15 plus 8, 23 minutes. So we've got a lot of time. Question 1? Yes, sir. Yes, Ms. Levin. Please state your name.
My question is directed to Dr. Phiri. When the Labour government were in power, they were committed to the abolition of private education as part of their egalitarian social engineering policy. I wonder if perhaps you can outline what plans you might have afoot to privatize education in the UK.
You've picked unerringly on the one area in which we have made least progress. Education in Britain is very much in the hands of the enemy. People say the answer is educational vouchers, but we have 800 ministerial bureaucrats who have sworn to disembowel themselves publicly on the steps of Whitehall if ever the word education voucher is uttered in the ministry. So we do face a sort of technical problem. Of course, we regard any problem as an opportunity for solutions to be provided, and that is the highest priority, I think, for the next 18 months. Yes, there are proposals for education, not to privatise it, but to introduce market forces, so that the preferences of parents allocate the resources which go to the schools. I will not outline it now because we don't have much time, and because Mr. Eustace Davis is giving a session on education this afternoon which will feature similar proposals.
Yes, sir. Can you give it? Or can you use that mic that's outside next to you there? Oh, good. It doesn't seem to work. All right, can we use that, Lil? Thanks. Can I?
Hello there.
Good.
My name is Mills. I'd like to direct a question to Dr. Perry on civil engineering, the situation on civil engineering in Britain. Now, one could say there are three distinct phases or aspects of civil engineering. The first is planning and design, the second is construction, and the third is maintenance. And I should like to ask Dr. Perry what proportions of these three functions are performed by the private sector and the public sector in Britain. Thinking of civil engineering facilities such as water supply, roads, railways, harbours, airfields.
These areas have been traditionally in the purview of government and are being privatised as far as possible. The harbours have already gone. Associated British Ports was formed and privatised. The airports are being privatised this year, this summer. Roads, we have not traditionally had toll roads in Britain, and we are experimenting with a scheme whereby the government will pay the toll to private builders and operators on behalf of the public. In other words, instead of the vehicles having to stop to pay a toll, they will simply be counted electronically, and the government will then pay the toll on their behalf. This makes it a genuine risk capital project under our Treasury rules. Otherwise, it would simply be part of public borrowing. If the civil engineers, if the civil engineering firms building the road receive an automatic return, that would count as public borrowing and increase the national debt. But basing it on the frequency of traffic means that if they make a mistake, they'll lose money. That satisfies our Treasury that it's risk capital. So the answer is that while all 10 years ago, all of those areas were dominated entirely in the public sector, private enterprise is making headway in all of them, but roads least of all.
Thank you. I think that gentleman, yes.
My name is Rudolf Geus from Rand Merchant Bank. What if Dr. Perry could just expand on the issues and arguments surrounding the use of the proceeds of the sales of state assets at the time, and where that argument might be heading and what South Africa might perhaps learn from that?
Very bluntly, we use the proceeds to cut taxation. We use the proceeds from capital sales for the use of immediate tax reduction on the current side. The argument goes, should we be using what is essentially a capital fund in order to finance the current spending by government? And the answer is yes, of course we should. If you sell public assets, and in many cases, remember, we're selling them to the public, and the public are getting their hands on them for the first time. They're only nominally public assets and in fact controlled by bureaucrats. What we're doing is dispersing them into real ownership by the public, where they can control them and get the benefit from them. But that aside, we take the view that it is entirely legitimate, and indeed there is a strong incentive upon government to use it to make immediate reductions in taxation. We've estimated this can go on for at least a decade, at the present rate, probably at the present rate increase, before we start running down. By then, the private sector accumulation benefits, the reduction of subsidy spending, the taxes that are being paid by the private companies, will mean that the cost of government itself is very much less, and we don't need to raise so much in taxation.
Thanks.
May I add just a quick comment?
Sorry.
A very interesting example from American history. of using the revenues from asset sales precisely to reduce debt. As you know, the United States came into existence after winning a war against Britain, which led to the building up of an initial debt. There was another, that was in 1776 through for about the next 5 years. There was another war with Britain in 1812, called the War of 1812. The combined debt of those two wars was a major burden on the young American government. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, two of our early presidents, had a great abhorrence of public sector debt and came up with the idea of setting up an earmarked fund into which the proceeds from land sales, government land sales, were put. And so during the early years of the westward expansion of America, for about a 25-year period, all the revenues from the government selling land to settlers as the West was open went into that land fund, and by about, I forget exactly which year, but by about 1835 or about 1835, the entire debt of the U.S. government was liquidated, and the government was debt-free for several years. But then, of course, the politicians began new spending, and ever since we've had debts. But it's a very nice example of using the proceeds from asset sales exclusively to retire government debt.
Thank you very much, Bob. Mr. Thereafter, it will be you, and then you. Okay.
From the group and Yanez Desil group. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to pass a comment and then address a question to Dr. Peary. My comment is that there may be a contradiction in terms, but in the new French government, there is a minister for denationalization and privatization. What is interesting to note, however, is that in addition to this honorable gentleman, there are two more ministers. One is a junior one that are directly involved in privatization. I know the French and their idiosyncrasies, and I doubt that they will ever take a leaf out of the British book, and I deplore it because I think that Britain is setting a fantastic example to all of us. My question to Dr. Peary is that I'm afraid I didn't quite understand what he said about privatization of council homes. He mentioned the first figure 20%, then a second one 50%, then a third one 70% discount. Does that mean, how does he justify to the last people, to the first people that bought their houses at a 20% discount, but the last one to be converted to the good cause are getting a discount of 70%.
Did we not agree? Did we not agree on a penny a day? The discounts are offered on the basis of how long the resident has lived in the house. They have been paying rent for 2 years, therefore they are entitled to 20% off. If they have been paying rent for 20 years, then it is assumed they have been making a contribution via those rents and are entitled to 50% off. It is not based on how recently they decided to buy, it's based on their length of tenure in public housing. We have now extended that so that it's not tied to a particular house. If you have been a tenant of the government for 20 years, you get the 50% discount. And we've been raising it, the latest bill to go through Parliament has raised the maximum discount to 70%. So as far as justifying it, we have to justify it to the rest of society. Why should people who are buying their own homes have to pay a full market price, and people who live in government homes get a discounted price? And the answer we give is that all we are disposing of is a debt. Those who are paying full price in the private sector will find their property taxes reduced because they no longer have to pay subsidized rents for those living in the public sector.
Thank you. Next speaker. That's a question, sorry.
Mr. Chairman, yes, my name is Lund from the South African Institute of Economic Affairs. I would like to ask Dr. Peary and Mr. Thulo a question related to the privatization of government activities as well as local government activities, which we spoke about yesterday. The question I have is, to what extent did the promotional aspects play a role in the privatization of the various examples quoted, and what mode of promotion was implemented in these cases?
By promotion, do you mean public relations campaign? Yes, there was an intellectual battle to be won, and it was not won by theoretical argument. It is very important to realise that the British government did not have to win the case for privatisation in order to be able to adopt the policy. They adopted the policy first, and having found it successful in one or two cases, used the success to build upon. And they were able to convince the public that privatisation is a good thing because it has worked so well. Mrs. Thatcher's popularity goes up and down, so does that of the Conservative Party. Popularity of privatisation remains at about 75 to 80%. The British people just assume that anything which is privatised will immediately become more efficient and profitable and produce better services, and they are right to assume it because it is true. So the answer is that on a theoretical level, we use the practical experience. That is one reason why, incidentally, the French will never copy. The French will first have to produce a system which embraces and explains the whole universe and includes privatisation. It is in our national character in Britain that if something works 4 times, we call it a universal truth. We do promotion extensively on an individual basis. We spent a lot of money, millions of pounds, on the privatisation of telecom, just on promoting it, on advertising it. And we run extensive television commercials and newspaper commercials, and we hire private public relations agencies, and we have merchant banks handling the sales for us, different ones each time, to give everyone a share of the market. And very extensive advertising for individual ones. Even now, you can see electricity starting up. The bill has not been announced yet, but one can tell when adverts come on television telling people of the advantages of using electricity. I know a PR campaign aimed at privatisation when I see one.
Thank you.
Let me say a couple of words, if I may.
Right,
about,
Robert.
The efforts to popularize privatization in the United States. Again, since we haven't had major campaigns at the national government level, there hasn't really been the kind of effort that Dr. Perry talked about with respect to British Telecom. But at the level of local government, privatization has been advanced very significantly thanks to the efforts of several of our think tanks, including our own local government center, which is part of my organization. The way we have done that is to provide low-key information to journalists and to local government officials. On the practical aspects, it's the same sort of thing that has been applied in Britain at the national level. Not so much creating grand theoretical arguments, although there's been some of that. There have been probably 5 books now that have been published in America making the arguments and giving examples through case studies of the success of privatization and giving a theoretical rationale. But the main tool has been simply widespread dissemination of case studies and examples showing people in one local authority that other local authorities have done very well for their taxpayers and for their constituents by shifting to privatization and making themselves politically successful by doing so. Just getting the information around. You know, we have met thousands and thousands of local governments all across the country, and so the sheer magnitude of the information problem has been a barrier. I think there would have been more privatization if there had been even more widespread dissemination of the information. They simply don't know in Montana what's been going on in California very easily. And so one of the big important tasks of our free market-oriented think tanks has been to figure out ways to get that information spread widely. And now we even have, as I told people yesterday, a computerized data bank with 27,000 specific instances of local privatization cataloged and categorized so that when people inquire about a particular area of privatization, such as street sweeping, in a particular geographical area of the United States, we can give them a printout of precisely which local authorities have already done it, so that it's easy for another authority to obtain the information and learn from their peers.
Thank you, Robert. We have 8 minutes. The gentleman at the end there, I don't know, Lily, can you reach, gentleman? I don't know whether that mic works, not too sure. Okay, it works.
My name is Piet Strijdom. Mr. Chairman, through you, a question to Dr. Piri. If we sell public enterprises under the assumption that they will abide by private sector rules thereafter, then I take it that you also have to change management and replace the bureaucrats by a new team of managers who are sensitive to market information. And how do you go about changing from one team to the next?
Yes, you are correct. A very different type of management is required. The answer is we let the market do it. We allow, when we privatize a company like Telecom, we let the management team go intact into the private sector, assuming that the private sector will do our work for us, of selecting the individuals who are the ones with talent and initiative and ability. And we find that this is true, that very rapidly, within the space of a couple of years, those who are more suited to the calmer waters of bureaucratic life are very rapidly given their pensions and gently given the kick up the backside, or whatever it's called, and younger people start being promoted. You see, in our bureaucracy in Britain, promotion very much depends on seniority, whereas in the private sector, ability is a much stronger factor, and people who are much younger are able to get to the top. And so when the thing goes into the private sector, we find that the competitive pressures simply bring the right people to the top very quickly. Where we do need to make a change is when we are preparing something for privatization. See, many of our state sector piggies get very fat before we send them to market. We have to often prepare them. If a state operation is losing heavily, we sometimes have to put in a very tight management team, and they're told, you've got 2 years or 2.5 years, and then you're going to be sold. And it's amazing what a new team can do. As Dr. Johnson said, it concentrates hanged in 2 weeks. Well, similarly, with a state operation, like British Airways, losing money hand over fist 3 years ago, now it's highly profitable. And the reason is we put in Lord King and a new management team, and they were told, get it ready for sale. So you put in the new team before the privatization, not afterwards, and you let the private sector itself bring the right people to the top.
Thank you. Before then, there was Terry. Oh, Terry, can you hold, please? The gentleman at the end there, please.
Yesterday we heard that she was I think it's going to decide what that is my ego. But isn't it a fact that there were in the private sector a lot of companies Mr. Poole, I would like to ask a question. I don't think for its mental. What does it mean that there will be more?
I think, sir, you have misunderstood me. The point I was trying to make is that And the fact that those same people, managers and workforce, can go into the private sector and immediately turn a company around shows there is nothing wrong with now it's highly under which it's operating before.
papers and hold our questions till after the second speaker. Our first speaker, I'm very proud to introduce to you, is Mr. Michael O'Dowd. Mr. O'Dowd is a manager and alternate director of Anglo-American Corporation. He is also chairman of the Anglo-American and De Beers Group Chairman's Fund. And he's a director of numerous other companies, including Highfeld Steel. He is chairman of our foundation, the Free Market Foundation, a member of the Council of the Trade Policy Research Centre, and a fellow of the Institute of Directors. He serves on the Council of the University of the Witwatersrand and of the University of Bophuthatswana, and is on the Board of Governors of St John's College, St Mary's Waverley, and St Martin's Rosettenville. He's Honorary Life President of the Association of Private Schools and was a member of the De Lange Commission of Inquiry. His interests cover history and economics and politics, particularly in their relationship to each other and to contemporary affairs. We are looking forward, Mr. O'Dowd, to your customary penetrating analysis and insight, this time into the question of resolving the water shortage by privatisation. Mr. O'Dowd.
Ladies and gentlemen, the subject that I'm going to talk about is slightly separated from what we've been discussing so far, and I think from what we'll be discussing for most of the rest of the day. And one of the reasons why I chose to speak about it is because, apart from its own inherent importance in this country, it illustrates some very interesting principles. Now, strictly speaking, we are not talking about privatizing water. Water is already private. What I'm going to discuss here is in fact a proposal not for privatization, but for decontrol. And, you know, decontrol is an interesting concept because it actually represents the one exception to the principle that there are no free lunches. If there was a lunch set out in the foyer here, a beautiful lunch all prepared and ready, and a law saying that nobody could eat it, if you repealed that law, you would have a free lunch. And this is the situation which actually exists quite extensively in economies, both in ours and in others. And that is that there are assets held out of use or prevented from being used in their most advantageous way by restrictions which the law imposes on how they may be used. If these restrictions are lifted, one simply appears to create wealth out of nothing. And this is the situation we face with water in South Africa. There is not a shortage of water. And simply by changing the rules under which water is used, we could find that we had all the water we want. Now, to gallop very briefly through the principles involved here, whenever there's a scarce resource, somebody has to decide which uses it will be put to and which uses it will be passed up. And basically, there are the three ways of tackling this, and then a fourth one, which in principle isn't in there in principle, but in practice is. The first one is commonage, where anybody who falls within a certain definition can walk into the asset and make use of it until somebody else gets in his way. This is the principle on which, for example, beaches are used. And it only works with an asset which is rarely in free supply, where there's no genuine shortage. Then there is the principle, there is public control, where somebody who is appointed by somebody sits there and decides, do this, don't do that, which is the basic concept of public ownership. And of course, the weaknesses of public ownership in practice turn on two issues. Not, if I could emphasize a point which was made just now, not that the controller is stupid. The controller is not usually stupid and may indeed be somebody of very great ability. But it turns on two issues. The one is that the controller is not actually motivated to control the thing for its best use. The controller, of course, is motivated to act in accordance with the reward and penalty system under which he works. And this system very, very seldom actually motivates the controller to do the best possible job. The other thing, which is insuperable, is that the controller never actually has all the information that he requires in order to do his job. And if thinking about water, for example, it is very obvious that nobody sitting in Pretoria could know what the best use would be to make of the water of a little river flowing in the Eastern Transvaal or in the Cape. The third system is, of course, the system of private ownership, where an asset is owned by an individual, and the individual, subject to some restrictions usually imposed by law, is free to use the asset for his own purposes. And although this is not infallible, the overwhelming tendency of this system is that the assets are moved into the hands of those who can make the best use of them. Because if somebody knows of a better use to put the asset to than the person who has it, he will come and offer that person a price which to that person is more than the thing is worth. And therefore, there's this steady tendency to move assets into the hands of those who can make the best use of them. And having bought them with the object of making the best use of them, you jolly well have to make the best use of them, because otherwise you lose your money. Now, as I say, this system is not infallible. There are exceptions. But it works in the great majority of cases, and that's why it works better than the others. Now, as I say, the fourth system is an anomaly which shouldn't exist, but it happens to be the system under which our water is allocated. And this is where you have either nominal public ownership or nominal private ownership, but in either case, the actual system is that somebody has a limited right to use the thing. That as long as he uses it in the way that, within the framework of that limited right, it's his. And but he is forbidden to use it for any other purpose. And if he doesn't want to use it, he's got to abandon it. Now, this, of course, is the system of public housing. If you have a public house, not a public house, a house owned by a public authority of which you are the privileged tenant at a subsidized rental, as long as you live in the house, you can you have a very valuable asset because you're being subsidized. But if you move out of the house, there's no compensation, and you're not allowed to sell your tenancy and your privilege to somebody else. So one of the things is you'll stay in that house, even though other things being equal, it would be advantageous to you to move elsewhere. And one of the effects of public housing is to restrict mobility. Now, our water system in South Africa bears a very strong resemblance to this public housing setup. And I want to emphasize that the proposal I'm going to make does not involve taking anything away from anybody. On the contrary, it is going to give more to the people who already have, and it is going to make new assets available. The basic principle, now first of all, let me make it clear, I'm talking about surface water, rivers, dams, lakes. Groundwater, which can be pumped out of the ground, is not on the whole subject to the restrictions that I'm going to talk about. But surface water is overwhelmingly the main water resource in the country. Now, the basic principle of our water law is that the right to extract water from a river attaches to the land which adjoins the river, the so-called riparian land. And the riparian owner is entitled to his pro rata share of the available water, provided he uses it for agricultural purposes on the riparian land. And he may not use it in any other way whatsoever. And if he doesn't use it on his riparian land, it simply flows on, and the pro rata shares of the other people further down the river go up accordingly. Now, the problem of allocation, of deciding what are the pro rata shares, of getting everybody their fair share, has received a great deal of attention over the years, and I think one can say has been significantly solved. Furthermore, the water law takes the view that agriculture has an absolute priority for the use of water. The law used to talk, I don't think it's in the modern law, but the concept is still there, of secondary and tertiary use of water. Primary use of water was for drinking, and that is a negligible use. Secondary use was for agriculture, tertiary use was for all other purposes, that is for industry. And so you have built into the law the concept that there's an absolute priority of one use over another. This is clearly unsound, and one can see just how unsound it is by the fact that the agriculture contributes 5% of the gross national product of South Africa and uses about 70% of the available water. The rest of the economy contributes 95% and uses about 30% of the available water. And it is that 95% of the economy that's constantly being told that there's no water. But it's much worse than that, because the fact is that the irrigation water is not used to produce 5% of the gross national product. It is used to produce a great deal less than that, because most of our biggest agricultural activities don't use irrigation water. Of the maize crop, hardly any of it is dependent on irrigation. Of the wheat crop, the greater part is not dependent on irrigation, and so on could go on. I have not been able to identify the percentage of the gross national product which is produced by that 70% of the water, but it's quite tiny. Now, this line of argument seems to point, and has in the past usually been taken to point, to the desirability of nationalizing water. And many people have put forward the proposal that this business of, because of this obvious imbalance, because of this obvious uneconomical use of water, water must be taken into the public domain, and some chap in Pretoria must sit and decide what can be done with the water. And here, of course, we come up against Dr. Piri's point. The vested interests which are mobilized against a proposal of that kind are extremely powerful. And we will not solve our water problem by nationalization. Therefore, my proposal is that we solve our water problem by decontrol. And this is the proposal. It should be recognized that the riparian owners have a right of property. And instead of taking that right of property away from them, the restrictions on that right of property should be removed. And the riparian owner should be considered to own the water, which he is at present entitled to extract from the river, and should be entitled to sell that water to anybody for any purpose, at any price. Now, the effect of this will not be, as people would often assume, that there will be a massive abandonment of irrigated land as the water is bought for industrial purposes. Certainly, water will be bought for industrial purposes, and there will no longer be a scarcity of industrial water. But I do not believe that there will be any abandonment of irrigation at all. And the reason for that is this. Because a farmer cannot use or cannot get any value for any water which he does not put on his riparian land. He can't even put it on another farm which he owns, if that farm is not riparian. He has no incentive to economize the way in which he irrigates. And in particular, he has no incentive, and in fact it would be totally economically irrational for him to spend capital to save water. And the result is that highly efficient water-saving techniques of irrigation, which have been developed for the most part in Israel, are scarcely used in South Africa at all. And let me emphasize, that's not because the farmers are stupid. the fact is the farmers would have to be stupid under the existing water law in order to use these methods, because it is going to cost capital to install a more efficient irrigation system. So you spend money and you save water. Unless you can use that water that you save on your own riparian land, you have to let it flow past and go free to other people who have not spent capital to conserve it. So this is a perfect example of the way, in principle, restrictions on the market, restrictions on ownership, lead to the not merely to the allocation of resources as between two uses, but to the actual waste. And water is being wasted in South African irrigation on a very, very, very large scale. So I believe that what would happen if my proposal was implemented would be that there would be a very rapid implementation of highly efficient water-saving systems of irrigation. Large quantities of water, surplus water, would then be offered on the market. Actually, of course, it doesn't happen quite in that order, because people would only implement the water-saving schemes as fast as they could find a market for their surplus water. That the surplus water that would be made available would actually exceed the requirements of industry and would be transferred onto non-riparian land, which at present is not possible. You can, by special, there are ways of getting water for industry, obviously, because otherwise there wouldn't be any, but there are no ways of getting permission to transfer water from riparian land to non-riparian land, except when there's a formal irrigation scheme. And then the water becomes allocated to the people who are members of that irrigation scheme, but it can't be transferred outside it. So I believe that this proposal, which I put forward here, would lead to an increase in irrigation in South Africa. It would lead to more land being put under irrigation, more crops being produced under irrigation, and because irrigating agriculture is labor intensive, the creation of additional jobs. That, of course, is in the relatively short term. If in the very long term, the use of water for industrial purposes is so much more productive than its use for agriculture, certainly this system would lead to the progressive withdrawal of water from agriculture into industry. But I see no reason to suppose that that this would ever lead to the total abandonment of agriculture, because we mustn't assume that the chances for conserving water end with the techniques for irrigation which already exist. Under a regime where there was a maximum economic incentive to save water, there would be a constant innovation of water-saving techniques, both in agriculture and in industry. And let me make the other point, that under this system, as I visualize it, industrialists would also have to buy their water. It wouldn't be first secured by a water board and then sold at whatever sub-economic or other funny price might be determined. An industrialist who wanted to start a water-intensive industry would have to secure his own water in the market, and consequently, of course, would be directed by the market to the place in the country where the water was cheapest, which would generally be where there weren't competing users of water, where irrigation is not practicable, as on the Gala, for example, where there are huge quantities of water and no land which can practically be irrigated from it, or where irrigation is least profitable. Because remember, this is the other thing that the market would do. If water was withdrawn from agriculture, it would be withdrawn from the least profitable area of agriculture, because those would be the farmers who would be prepared to take the smallest price. And finally, remember, nobody would be involuntarily ousted from agriculture for any other use of water. The existing holders of the water become its owners. It would be their voluntary decision if they sold out in order to make the water available for more productive purposes. And so it really seems to me that what we've got here is an opportunity virtually to get something for nothing, at no cost to anybody, a very substantial increase in our national resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Dowd. Our next speaker on the subject of creating self-employment opportunities by privatisation is Mr. Leon Lowe. Mr. Lowe is Executive Director of the Free Market Foundation and has been since 1978. He was a member of the Swart Commission of Inquiry into the Economic Development of Ciskei and is still Chairman of Ciskei's Law Reform Committee. He's also a Director of the South African Law Review Project. He's Chairman of the Montessori Primary School Board and a member of the Woodmead High School Board, and also a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. He's had many articles and papers published, as many of you know. I do commend to you his new book produced with his wife called South Africa, the Solution, a brilliant book which I hope many of you may read. He's a regular speaker at conferences and seminars and on radio and TV, both here and overseas. Now, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, his background is also that of a lawyer, a blot on an otherwise distinguished career, but I believe he's risen above it and is saved by the fact that he was a keen rugby player. Mr. Leon Lowe.
In discussing creating self-employment opportunities through privatisation, I'm going to speak mostly, almost exclusively in fact, about creating black business opportunities or business opportunities for blacks. This is not because of a view that it needs to be a particularly racially inclined policy, but simply because, as it happens, there are more blacks who are presently disadvantaged and potential entrepreneurs than there are whites. But let me say that when I refer to opportunities for blacks, I intend this to include whites who start off in the same position. For example, a white person presently with perhaps a poor education and without any capital, who has an entrepreneurial inclination, is in the same position, in my view, as a black person. And the historical disadvantage that blacks have suffered simply means that there are more of blacks as a proportion of the population than there are of whites who are artificially not at present self-employed or entrepreneurs. There is an aspect of South African history which I am going to divert onto initially and hope to popularize in our book, which has just been mentioned, and that is an endeavor to dispel a widespread myth here and abroad, and in South Africa amongst whites and blacks alike, unfortunately, that blacks do not have an entrepreneurial disposition or culture, that blacks need to be somehow converted to the Western entrepreneurial spirit. There's a view that blacks are somehow culturally or inherently not good farmers. And without going into the detail, let me say that there was a period in South African history, which we call in the book the Golden Era, when blacks, at that time much more disadvantaged than they are now, were permitted equal and free access to a free economy in South Africa. That is roughly between 1850 and 1880, a period of about 30 years, which would be the golden era. And during that time, there was such a dazzling and spectacular advance of black entrepreneurship and agriculture that it actually led to the destruction of that very progressive black society. Thousands of black commercial farmers, traders, industrialists, transport riders blossomed throughout South Africa, particularly in the Eastern Cape. And that very prosperity led to a series of quite disgraceful measures adopted by and on behalf of whites to drive and keep blacks out of the economy, so that by the time we enter this century, or at least certainly by the 1920s, the full, what we might call destruction or rape of blacks had already occurred. The view that it's a post-1948 phenomenon, or for that matter, even that the creation of apartheid was an invention of a South African government, turns out historically not to be correct. The damage was done entirely by the time of union, and since then additional measures have been added that have made the position worse. But there was a time, which is important, when simple access was permitted. No aid programs, no job creation programs, no business development programs, no black advancement programs. Simple freedom of opportunity existed, and there was such a dazzling and impressive response that blacks were the admiration of observers from all over the world. Now, that piece of history is known to a handful of academics, but hitherto has not been popularized, and I believe is important both to dispel paternalistic, arrogant, and racist white assumptions about blacks, and also to encourage blacks themselves to realize that this is consistent with their own traditions, cultures, and nature. And let me say too that I believe this is true of all of humanity. I think as you look about the globe, there is no correlation, or very little correlation, between people's cultures and races and ethnicity, or the size of the country, or the natural resource endowment of the country, or the history or the age of the country, or whether it's first or third world or whatever. What you find when you look around the world is that economies which are largely privatized and deregulated are economies and societies that prosper regardless of all other considerations. On natural resource endowment, strikingly, there's almost a reverse correlation. Countries which are well endowed with natural resources are typically economic failures, and countries that are poorly endowed with natural resources are typically successful and wealthy countries, with the possible exception of the USA, which is both successful and well endowed. But that is actually strikingly unusual. So all people anywhere in the world, in my judgment, respond with the same spectacular enthusiasm to the creation of opportunities. We are now in South Africa at a time where there is a once-off unique opportunity facing us to bring about the most rapid purging of the consequences of racial discrimination, going back in South Africa, incidentally, to 1580, which, as far as I can tell, was the first race law, when blacks and whites were forbidden from trading with each other and having sex with each other, both of which they often wanted to do at the same time. Now, this opportunity is the privatization option. For whatever reason, mistakenly or otherwise, South Africa has a very, very large amount of socialized or nationalized assets and industries and land, especially, it turns out, in the black areas. I've often made the controversial observation that the trouble with apartheid is and was that blacks in black areas lived, and always will have lived since the 1800s, in what is possibly the closest approximation to textbook Marxism which has ever been achieved in the world. Let me repeat that. In black areas, we have had the closest approximation to textbook Marxism ever achieved. That is to say, the closest thing to the elimination of class. The biggest proportion of national product in the hands of the state, ownership and or control. For example, in a black township or black homeland, all land is state-owned, all buildings. Businesses, until very recently, blacks, until about 1978, 79, blacks in black areas were forbidden from running businesses other than general dealerships, then only one, then limited to a maximum size, then without any form of competition by virtue of what was called, and still is called, a radius restriction, no more than 2 within a certain number of kilometers of each other, and so on. Now, to my knowledge, there is no Eastern Bloc country in which as much elimination of private ownership and control was achieved, even under Stalin's purges and Mao's Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward, as in the black areas of South Africa. That is where we start. As far as blacks are concerned, virtual total government ownership and control. In the white areas, a very high degree of government ownership and control. Here is an opportunity then for the state to divest itself, as is a formal policy, of this ownership and control, and it can be done in a way that can bring about another golden era for black and, incidentally at the same time, white progress and advancement as occurred during the third quarter of the last century. The many methods by which privatization can occur have been mentioned. 22, Dr. Piri says by the time he gets back, maybe 23. In 59, shall we say 60 areas, and at least in the USA, 27,000 cases have been studied, and the report we have is that worldwide it is overwhelmingly successful. Many people say, what about the third world? What about the developing world, which we are? I want to just quote briefly from a recent publication of the Adam Smith Institute, Dr. Piri's institute, called Privatization Worldwide, which is divided into a summary of what's been going on in many countries of the world, and it reads as follows. Regarding the third world, the developing world, what is remarkable about the progress of privatization in the third world is its diversity. Virtually no country remains unaffected by it. The range of industries and services which it has already touched is astonishing, although it is clearly still in its very early stages. No less remarkable is the ease with which the third world finds itself able to privatize. Now that is very, very important. In a developing world, for all sorts of reasons which we won't discuss now, it is actually easier to privatize than in the USA or Britain, where you have all sorts of massive empires and vested interests aligned against it. The Financial Times reported, everywhere the state is in retreat. And that is true also of the developing world, which is important for us. Well, the kinds of areas in which small business or self-employment opportunities are most easily created, firstly by simply deregulating. If we take SATS, with buses, trains, whatever, South African transport services, you can privatize simply by allowing black combi taxis and urban taxis or whatever, buses, into the market. That will mean there will be a bigger and bigger percentage of privately owned and operated transport services. In Ciskei, where I've been involved in the deregulation process, there was a summary midnight repeal of all regulation relating to transport. That is, economic regulations, safety regulations continue to apply, and there was no drop-off in bus business. Indeed, it's increased, but there has been an estimate of 3 times as many combi taxis within the first year, and according to the insurance companies selling public liability discs, it's a lot higher than that. There is just an explosion, a visible explosion, of thousands of self-employed, owner-operated combi and other forms of taxi, minibus, and even large bus operators at no loss to the existing bus operation and railway service, which shows that there was simply an unsatisfied demand. Or alternatively shows that along with that and other regulations, there's been a massive growth in activity. So deregulation itself is a form of privatization. But then there are many others. In black areas, I think immediately of clinics. Dr. Motlana is chairman of a black-owned clinic. But the state could privatize, as that one is, a private clinic. All the clinics in black areas, all the hospitals in black areas, there are qualified black doctors who could take them over, and for that matter, white doctors. But there is a case that can be made for some, at least initial preference to be given to local blacks or people in the black community. Then we've heard of all sorts of other things that lend themselves so obviously to self-employment, small business, opportunity creation, mowing services, building of fences, cleaning of buildings, security operations. Every given government building in black areas has security. Well, why not have black security businesses? Or white ones. I'm not particularly black or white, small business in new entrepreneurs. Transport. And when we talk of transport, everyone always talks, and one understands why, buses and taxis and rickshaws or whatever, cycle cabs, piggybacking, whatever. But it seems to me that I would like to urge blacks to think of another potential area, which is airlines. Little private commuter services in 4-seater aeroplanes or 6-seater aeroplanes can be bought second-hand at the same price as a motor car. Deregulation of air travel can produce an absolute explosion of, as has happened in the USA, little services all over. So let me say that we need a bit of lateral thinking too. We tend to get tunnel vision. Obvious areas, existing areas tend to get the focus. But that is one of many options that go way beyond what is normally thought of. Maintenance of government vehicles, ownership of government vehicles that can be leased to government, all the backyard mechanics in the black areas, the ones who are not formally qualified because they didn't have enough formal schooling, existing privatizable activities, building maintenance, equipment maintenance, and so on. Existing operations, for example, cleansing operations in Soweto, Dip Meadow, wherever, can be sold off along the telecom model to the existing employees, convert them into a company, sell them shares, or by contracting out. Owner-operator, for example, if government-owned buses are to be sold off, there are lots of ways of doing it. One is converting a government large corporation monopoly into a private large corporation monopoly. But how about just simply auctioning the buses off one by one? And if a big corporation happens to buy them all, well then that's fine. They've outbid the little people. But do it in a way that ordinary individuals can buy. So that I think what we're looking at essentially is to privatize so as to give the small person at least an equal opportunity, if not some kind of preferred opportunity to overcome historic disadvantages. Housing in black areas, contract out the building, allow black property developers to emerge. It's an interesting thing for those of you that don't know this, the whites who don't read black newspapers, when you leave here, go and buy one at the kiosk downstairs and look in the Smalls classified ads and you will see no houses to let, houses for sale, properties for sale, buildings for sale, whatever columns. You buy a white newspaper and it takes up most of the pages of the small advertisements of the classified ads. This is because of an entirely undeveloped black property market. Now, the other thing that can be done there, I don't see John Knutzer with us, but other administration board people or development board people are here, is privatization. Is hand over the privatization of black housing, which is occurring on a massive scale. 500,000, incidentally, Dr. Perry, we're going to catch up to Britain. We have a program now for 500,000 houses to be privatized. But how about doing it by just handing it to black estate agents, white estate agents, the private sector, not commercial banks, merchant banks and others, building societies. Now the question of preference, it is NAFCOC and I presume also the Soweto Chamber's official position, who are one of the co-sponsors here today, that there needs to be an initial period in South Africa during which blacks in black areas have some protection against whites who have more capital and experience, whatever, 5 years or 10 years or some period to give blacks a chance to get off the ground before throwing it open completely. This can be debated whether it's right or wrong, but let me propose a privatization strategy which is to offer to people in the local community, whether they be black or white, in whichever community you're privatizing, say, for example, a guaranteed 20% of the privatized business or assets, and maybe a 10% price preference or tender preference. In other words, if you bid or come in at 10% lower than somebody not from that community, you get the business anyway. This can lead to, and then what do you do with the proceeds? Massive proceeds will be generated in South Africa through privatization. We saw that with the Sasol experience. Well, the proceeds can be allocated, I believe, to make blacks in particular benefit twice over. That is, not only by being able to buy up the businesses, but by getting the proceeds. And I propose that privatization proceeds go into a fund which is constitutionally, in terms of the fund's constitution, required to be used to develop black areas and black businesses. In other words, that either it's loans or, for example, an idea that I quite like, I haven't thought it through, is the concept of enterprise vouchers. Is distribute to blacks equally, all of them, enterprise vouchers with the proceeds of privatization, and enterprise vouchers can be used only to buy shares in businesses, whatever business, possibly, or use the proceeds to develop black areas. Or, my own preference is distribute cash, simple money, dish out 50 Rand notes equally to all people, because for all sorts of economic reasons that will maximize the utility function of the proceeds of privatization. Now, the other attractive thing about this is plowing the proceeds back into black development, especially business development, is it's a very interesting anti-disinvestment option. Imagine if we invite foreign companies to bid for local companies, and one of the requirements is that the proceeds go into the black community. I should imagine that the most fervent anti-investment lobbyists would find it difficult to reject a foreign investment of that kind. In other words, that foreign investment used to buy up privatized assets will be plowed back into developing black areas, black education, clinics, businesses, whatever. The financial implications are interesting. It means, of course, taxes can be reduced, revenues can go up, subsidies, we can stop incurring the cost of subsidies, we've heard all that, but the political implications, of course, are that it is politically popular to privatize. It could bring about a sense of legitimacy to black local authorities, depoliticize South Africa generally. I think, in fact, privatization is probably the single most effective thing that can be done in South Africa right now to solve the political problems. The one thing that on its own, if it's done effectively on a grand enough scale, would make a bigger contribution than any other single thing I can think about to depoliticizing and conflict reduction in South Africa. You know that when somebody was asked how good the transport service is in Soweto, Soweto residents said it's very good, a bus is only a stone's throw away. Well, if buses were privatized and deregulated, they would not be a stone's throw away. Then, of course, privatization, deregulation generates growth. All the world's experience tells us that is the way to maximize growth. And what better way to create a climate in which political solutions can be found than having a high growth economy in which people's living standards are rising and in which the state has less powers and functions. Government ownership and control necessarily is conflict provoking, necessarily is politicizing. And I'm just going to take a moment off here to demonstrate that. Let us take something that is not politicized at all. Let us say trousers, the pants I'm wearing, are not a source of political conflict as far as I know. and nobody riots or strikes regarding my trousers or yours or anyone else's. Why? Because trousers are entirely a private sector phenomenon. You never read newspaper articles saying the trouser price is up, poor people can't afford trousers, the rich are exploiting the poor, or whatever. Trousers are just something that nobody pays any attention to. As far as I know, the ANC and the ZAPO and the Weerstandsbeweging don't have a position on trousers, and trousers are about as much of a sort of peaceful issue in South African life as I can think about. Now, let us assume a different world. Let us assume a world in which we had a Trouser Development Corporation, a Trouser Control Board, and a Minister of Trouser Affairs. In that world, I would make all sorts of predictions. One is trousers would be a source of great conflict, and on May the 1st, the blacks would refuse to wear trousers, and we would have a trouser boycott. And we would have a problem right here now today with the black delegates being trouserless, or being intimidated and threatened with violence if they wore trousers. And every time the government announced the new trouser price and design, the new trouser prices and designs, what would you predict? Well, you would predict every political party would take a position. And what's so nice about South African politics is each party's position is also so predictable. I can tell you immediately what each party would say. The National Party, for example, would say that trousers must reflect orderly change. That is, they must start being black at the bottom and change progressively to white at the top. You can predict that that a ZAPO would say trousers should be equal. They should all be the same size and the same color, regardless of the people who wear them. And there needs to be an equal distribution of trousers. And if there aren't enough to go around, well, everyone only gets, say, one leg. The HNP would say that trousers, you can do much as you like with trousers, as long as trousers have no black spots. And as long as the trousers have vertical, clearly separated and delineated black and white lines. The CP would say, no, what you have to have is clearly delineated horizontal black and white lines. The Progressive Party would say that trousers should be blue, and that they should be subsidized for the poor, and the rich should not get more trousers, and so on. And the NRP's position is also predictable. It would say that we shouldn't be extremists, we shouldn't go one way or the other, and trousers should be sort of moderate. That is, they should all be knee length, they should all be grey, they should, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, you can play this sort of game, but nonetheless, trousers will be a source of conflict. We will fight about them. Everyone will have trouser policy. So, government ownership and control is the single biggest reason for conflict in South Africa. And where government owns and controls little, like in Hong Kong, no one has the vote and no one cares, or at least they have a meaningless vote. In Switzerland, women don't have the vote in 2 of the cantons and they don't care. And so it is ownership and control rather than politics which is the source of the problem. Now let me close off by dealing with some of the objections. And that is, firstly, in South Africa, as in Britain, privatization can and will be popular to the whole range of political positions, apart from the really extreme hardcore Marxists who one should probably be willing not to try to carry along. But it is a massively, potentially political, popularizing and moderating thing to do. Then the civil servants. We've heard, and I can only repeat, and Dr. Perry has shown us, that privatization should and can be done in such a way that there are no losers, only winners, Pareto optimal. Everybody needs to be a winner, and there needs to be no threatened person whatsoever. And I would like to even see the state president or the Minister of Privatization, Ellie Lowe, announce that nobody's position, nobody's job, nobody's status, nobody's salary is at risk. It needs to be seen by the civil servants to be in their own interests, that they will be gainers. And I think it can and will be so. I believe in Britain, in British Airways, there are people who are agitating for privatization, and they think it's unfair that the government has done telecom first, why not them first? Would it not be nice if South African Airways officials and staff started agitating that they want to be privatized like Sasol was, why not them? So, in conclusion then, it is, to my mind, the single most important way and the quickest and easiest way and the most popular way of creating a climate in which political solutions for South Africa become easier. It is the quickest single and a unique opportunity, quickest single way and a unique opportunity for bringing about a rapid, massive advancement of black enterprise and opportunity, another golden era, we might almost call it black economic revolution. And then that privatization itself should be privatized. There is nobody who will think of better ways than the private sector itself of privatizing. Put it out to consultants and contractors, of which we ourselves are one, and with that, let me hope that I've persuaded you that it creates opportunities that have political implications way beyond what the term itself generally implies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lowe. There's a message for Vera Beljakova at the registration desk, and management has restored our right of choice to us. Those who find smoking unpleasant, that side of the room is for you, and those who share my vice, this is our side of the room over here. I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we've run a little bit over time, and what I'm going to suggest is, rather than have questions and observations, now you rather move out for coffee and ask your questions and observations, put your observations over coffee to Mr. Lowe and Mr. O'Dowd. If there is time later in the day to come back to particular matters concerning their two papers, perhaps we can fit it in later on. But on your behalf, I'd like to thank them both very much indeed for their major contribution to our conference and for their very stimulating papers. Let us adjourn outside.
I see. Are we ready to kick off? Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ben Sibeko from the Greater Soweto Chamber of Commerce. My task here this morning is to chair over the third session of this conference on education and health. Our first speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I think this is a very interesting topic to us here, education and health, because those are the problems we're undergoing daily, especially we from the townships, black townships, about our education crisis. We hope when we leave here, we shall have achieved something. Right, before I introduce our first speaker, ladies and gentlemen, let me again introduce our Honorable Willie David from the USA. He's in the audience. This morning, Mr. Davis, the chairman wanted to introduce you and you're out. This is Willie Davis, ladies and gentlemen. He's a close friend of NAFCOC, having raised money in the US to launch black training program in South Africa. He's a very great friend of NAFCO. Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. Yeah. Now, our first speaker, ladies and gentlemen, in this session now is Mr. Eustace Davey, Administrative Director of Free Market Foundation. He was born
No, he was administrative director of the Free Market Foundation since 1981. He's a chartered accountant by profession, practiced as an accountant and auditor 1962 to 1981, a member of Montessori Society of South Africa Committee, a member of organizing committee of the International Education Conference to be held in Johannesburg in July 1986, member of the board on the founders of the Montessori Primary School, member of the Finance Committee of the Woodmead School. Now it's my pleasure to call upon you, Mr. Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we are presently witnessing an educational tragedy in South Africa. I think you will all agree with me that something has to be done very quickly to resolve the problems that we are facing. The schools are being burnt and damaged. They're being closed down. I heard over the news this morning that children, black children, are not going to school because of the intimidation, that they are taking correspondence courses because that is the only way they can receive an education under present conditions. The young people who would otherwise be in school are roaming the streets. They are the people, I was told, that young children of 10, 11, and 12 years old, they are the ones who are throwing the stones, burning the houses, and intimidating the adults in the black towns. Now that, I think you will all agree with me, that the crisis has taken on appalling dimensions. The question is what is to be done and what is being done. I was told recently about a new attempt that was being made by the Department of Education to do something about this problem as far as black education is concerned. And it really worries me about the way they went about it. What they did was to set up, or try to persuade the parents of the schools to set up committees to deal with the problems of the various schools. And when you look at the structure that was proposed, I'm not surprised that it was rejected. Someone who was requested to be chairman of one of these committees told me that if he accepted the structure that had been proposed to him, that was set out in the regulations that were given to him, he would have his house burnt down. Now, there's obviously some real hard thinking has to be done here, and it's necessary to get away completely from what has been done up to now. A consensus seems to be establishing amongst the proposals are that there should be a single education department. This is the demand of generally the black sector of the population. Now, I can understand why they're doing that. They are saying that this is the only way to get an equivalent type of education. If it's one department, then the education has to be the same. They're asking for equal facilities, equally qualified teachers. It is recognized. Oh, another thing they're asking for is the possibility of opening all schools to all children. Now, it is recognized that a rapid upgrading of facilities, teachers' qualifications, and so on are necessary, which of course will require a very much increased budget. And fears are expressed that there is just not enough money under present conditions to solve this problem. The government have accepted the challenge, and we had heard that there has been a 10-year plan decided on for the upgrading of education with a very much increased budget, but no detail, as the detail has not been spelt out. Now, at this juncture, it's necessary, it's critical to decide if the education is to be changed, in what direction are we to go? What kind of schooling will provide satisfactory results? Now, here I have a fear, and that is the white schooling in South Africa to be the benchmark? Stated differently, will we achieve the results we are looking for if black children in South Africa are given the same kind of education that white children are receiving in government schools? I'm afraid that the present crisis will obscure the deficiencies in our total education system. That means in the education of the white children in South Africa. Unfortunately, an analysis of the education system in South Africa is made very difficult by the situation. It's very difficult to do an objective analysis to find out what the deficiencies are, the real deficiencies. But what we do know is that the kind of education system we have in South Africa has failed abysmally elsewhere. I'm speaking here of compulsory, centrally controlled, monopolistic state education. As I said, as far as an analysis of South African education is concerned, it's very difficult to separate out the components. All we can do, because the picture is so blurred by the racial and political overtones, what I propose to do is to look at the USA, the country that spends the most money on education, on government education, the wealthiest country in the world, the most advanced country in the world. And let us look at what kind of result they're getting from a similar type of education. Milton and Rose Friedman, in their book, Beyond the Tyranny of the Status Quo, give us an insight into the problems being experienced in the US government school system. And I'd like to quote from their book. The present ferment about education will undoubtedly produce major changes. The question is not whether changes will occur, but rather what kind of changes. Will these changes simply strengthen the status quo, the present stranglehold of professional educators on the most important socialist institutions in our society, elementary and secondary public schools, and government colleges and universities? Or will changes in these institutions through a voucher system or tuition tax credits or some other device give parents greater choice of the schools their children attend? We believe, they say, that introducing competition can alone lead to a major improvement in the quality of schooling available to all strata in our society. The Friedmans are not optimistic about the present schooling system in the United States. Spending as a percentage of GNP has risen from 3.8% in 1929 to 8.5% in 1981. The per pupil expenditure has increased, and this is in real terms after adjustment for inflation, from $385 a year to $2,275 a year. And what are the results? President Reagan's National Commission on Excellence in Education reports that the College Board's Scholastic Aptitude Test, otherwise known as SAT, show, and I quote again, a virtually unbroken decline from 1963 to 1980. Average verbal scores fell over 50 points, and average mathematics scores dropped nearly 40 points. I'm told by Bob Poole that this has improved slightly during the last couple of years. I'm very pleased to hear that. Both the number and proportion of students demonstrating superior achievements on the SATs have dramatically declined. And between 1975 and 1980, remedial mathematics courses in public four-year colleges increased by 72% and now constitute 1/4 of all mathematics courses taught in those institutions. And here we're talking about the wealthiest nation on earth. Some more information on them. In an article in Reason magazine, that's the magazine published by Bob Poole's foundation, the Reason Foundation, educationalist and author Samuel Blumenfeld tells us that Americans employ 2 million teachers. Now, I think there's something like 230 million people in the United States. Is that right, Willie? In other words, it's almost 1% of the population. They have a universal compulsory education system that costs taxpayers $100 billion per year. They also have an ever-growing population of functional illiterates. Unbelievable, isn't it? Now, a functional illiterate, Blumenfeld defines for us, is people who cannot read training manuals, books, magazines, or product labels above a grade 4 or 5 level, as standard 2 or 3 here in South Africa. Estimates of the extent of functional illiteracy amongst the US adult population range from 25 to 50%. Bob tells me that it's generally accepted, Bob Poole that is, that it is generally accepted that the figure is at least 25%. And this includes people who have completed 12 years of schooling. Now, do you wonder why I'm asking whether we should really adopt or continue with the same kind of education that has failed so miserably in the United States, has failed in Britain, and has failed everywhere else. I say we certainly must not continue with that type of education, and particularly as it has been rejected by so many young people in this country. There's a good reason why they've rejected it. It's because of its deficiencies. It's because of the implications of the system. It's the structure of the education in South Africa that needs to be changed, and needs to be changed very quickly. As far as the white children in South Africa is concerned, I unfortunately couldn't get hold of a study done by a lecturer at Wits University on the subject. You have a look at the De Lange Committee report. They say what should be done, but they don't give a real analysis of the white education in South Africa and the results that are being obtained. What they do say, and this is significant, they say that the gap between school and tertiary education is too great. What they mean by that, of course, is that children who have completed 12 years of schooling are not prepared for university. Why? As I said, it's the structure. The problem lies with the structure. And the most dedicated teachers, the most able administrators, and the most talented pupils are frustrated by the present structure in South Africa. As Dr. Madsen Piri and Bob Poole were telling us, the people, if you change the conditions under which they have to work, the results differ tremendously. Move people, as Madsen Piri was saying, from a government employment to private employment, and miraculously the same people achieve tremendous results. They are smothered. People with talent are smothered by that structure. They cannot do otherwise. One of the things is they can't afford to take risks. If you're a private entrepreneur and you decide you want to set up a school, you have a look at all the details, you set up the school, and you can't attract pupils, you fail. You go out of business. But government sets up a school, and if the pupils are not attracted to their school, they force them to go to it. There's a substantial difference. What are the alternatives? If alternatives are to be found, Milton and Rose Friedman suggest tax credits and vouchers. This is being mooted also in the UK. There's a very strong movement in favour of vouchers, and Dr. Madsen Piri told us there's also a very strong built-in resistance to the implementation of the voucher system. But it is a possibility for South Africa. Dr. Piri was earlier asked about education. Why he didn't reply fully is because he told me last night that he would allow me to announce to you what the Adam Smith Institute are proposing in the UK. It was very kind of him. What he has identified is that it is the vital components are that the education should be controlled by the parents. And he's proposing for the UK elected school boards to take full control of the school, their particular schools. In other words, that means the appointment of teachers and every other aspect of that school. In other words, not only down to the community, devolving down to the community, but down to the school itself. Then a second component, and that is that there should be free choice of schools, free choice of government schools, abandonment of the idea of zoning for schools. What will the effect be? If a school is not performing very well and the children are unhappy, they will be able to move to another school, another government school. And then the third leg of this proposal, I think it's quite brilliant, is what Dr. Perry calls a capitation funding. That is, the state gives the funding not to the school, but to the pupil. So the school, the state school that is able to attract the most children will get the most money. Any development they need to do, they will be able to do because they'll have the funds to do it. The schools that are not providing a service that is popular with children and parents, well, they will simply go out of business. I think that has much to commend it. Then there is the tax credit and system and the voucher system. The tax credit system is a method whereby parents are given tax credits on their assessments to cover, Milton Friedman suggests, not more than 75% of the average cost of government schooling. He says costs will be reduced by at least 25% if dealt with on this basis. And tax credits should be available to parents who have children at both private and government schools. In other words, that means also that the funding of schools will be similar to Madsen Perry's idea, except that in the case of tax credits, the money will be coming direct from the parents. The voucher system is a system whereby something similar to a check is given to a child or parent to go and buy education with. The schools then take that voucher and cash it in with the education authorities. The proponents of tax credits and vouchers, or particularly tax credits, where the money is coming directly from the parents, is that the authorities should be expressly prohibited from imposing regulations on schools that are financed by parents and others receiving tax credits. And another component of their idea is that tax credits should be available not only to parents, but to others who are willing to finance the education of a child, and also that would be also to companies. The benefits to be derived from the implementation of an educational tax credit system, a voucher system, or Dr. Perry's system are, and this is most important in South Africa, depoliticized schooling. If it's controlled by the parents, it will be totally depoliticized. The children will have only their parents to blame, and the parents will only have themselves to blame if there's something deficient about the schooling. It would be possible to equalize the spending on both white and black children very rapidly, something that they say is not possible here. There would be a far greater choice of schools and types of education. There would be diversity of educational offerings to cater for the diversity in the South African society. There would be competition in schooling, which I submit would lead to a rapid improvement in standards. And children, particularly just disadvantaged children, would have the capability to exit from poor schools. And last but not least, I suggest that there would be a substantial reduction in the education system. Now, these are merely ideas. They are mechanisms to bring about a change. But ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, I think the time has arrived in South Africa where some ideas need to be tried, some ideas need to be used that will break the deadlock that we presently have and will allow all our children to go back to school again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davey. I'm sure what you have conveyed this morning, if the government machinery is here, they'll start working on it. These are very good and positive suggestions, if they could be implemented. Thank you very much for that. Before I proceed with to the next speaker, here's a message here for Dr. Harrison of Watermeyer, required at the desk outside, please. Now, our second speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Dr. Edwin Telahapi Herzog. This name reminds me of the old man, perhaps of my age, Dr. Herzog, the man we know so well. Now this one here is the son of Mr. Dick Herzog, joint founder of the Rembrandt Group and moving spirit in the founding of the Free Market Foundation. The medical studies completed at the University of Stellenbosch, specialized in anesthetics. He also studied at the University of Dundee. The managing director of Medi Clinic Corporation Limited, owners and operators of private medical clinics. He's a scholar of Rhodes, recipient of the A.B. Bailey Travel Bursary, and many other qualifications stated in his CV, which if I announce them here will take all the time of the session. Now it's my pleasure, Dr. Herzog, to call upon you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I was allocated 20 minutes to speak, and I can see we may run into a time problem. I will not take more than 20 minutes, and I would really like to listen to the whole paper of Professor Riki as well. To privatize or not to privatize, that is not the question in healthcare. In healthcare in South Africa, the question is how to privatize healthcare in the most efficient way and in the easiest way. There are many good reasons for the privatization of healthcare. I will not expand on them. You've heard many of the virtues already. However, when the real reason for a change in direction is that there is no other financial alternative, then one needs to take a closer look at this reason as well as to the logical alternative. If sufficient money does not exist to render services, does one stop to render these services? Or do you try to obtain somebody else to help you with the rendering of services, especially without any cost implication to oneself? When one talks about healthcare services, which are regarded as essential services in all civilized communities, then the answer is that one has to try and obtain somebody else to help carry the cost burden. Now, to support this viewpoint, I'd briefly like to quote from some of the important officials in the Department of National Health and Population Development. Dr. Willie van Niekerk, present Minister of National Health, when he announced his new financing and privatization policy for health services in January of this year, he said, "A deliberate and goal-orientated privatization policy must be followed to enable the private sector to increase its contribution to the healthcare field as part of the new dispensation." Dr. G. de V. Morrison, when he was still Deputy Minister of Health, At the opening of the seminar for the Medical Administrators Group of the Medical Association of South Africa in April 1985, he said, "We are aware that an increasing number of people among all the population groups belong to medical aid schemes. The private sector in a country like South Africa, where private enterprise is supported, should take up greater responsibility for the health care of its employees. This applies especially to the coloured and black population groups which have joined medical aid schemes in great numbers over the last years." A last quotation, and from a person which I regard very important, Dr. Francois Retief, the Director General of National Health for many years now. In his discussion of a national strategy for health, which he published in the 1985 Hospital and Nursing Yearbook, he stated, "State health services in many parts of the world are now inevitably curtailed by lack of resources, especially financial. Under these circumstances, a more active process of privatization of health services is indicated. The road to privatization is not without obstacles, but it is a necessity. Therefore, planning needs to be done to resolve the identified problems." One may very well say that this is all talk by politicians, but the stiff increase in all provincial hospital tariffs for medical aid members is a real and hard fact. So also is my final reference to an article which was published in Business Day, 18th of April, 2 weeks back. "Hospital cuts back on beds" was the title. It read, "A staff shortage of up to 50% in some wards," this is the Johannesburg General Hospital, "has forced the hospital to drastically reduce the number of beds it has available for private patients. Hospital Superintendent Dr. Reginald Brookman said a number of private patients would now be diverted from this hospital to the private hospitals. He said patients who could not afford private treatment would now get priority, but the hospital would try to accommodate emergency patients regardless of whether there were enough beds." Now remember that staff shortages can exist because of too few people available to do the job, but it can also exist because of too few jobs available in relation to the workload. In our private hospitals, we have never experienced any staff shortages apart from time to time in certain specialized areas like theatre or certain intensive care units. Seeing that close to 60% of the running costs of any hospital are due to salaries and wages, it is of course also the first place to start cutting on expenses. The present president of the SA Nursing Council has told me that if nurses of all population groups are to be employed by all hospitals, there should be no nurse shortage for the foreseeable future in South Africa. To give a South African colour to the hospital and healthcare scene, one has to look at the supply and demand figures appertaining to hospital care in South Africa. I'm firstly looking at the demand side. The demand for hospital facilities in any community depends mainly on two factors. The one is the size of the population, and the other is the average age of that population. American figures indicate that people of 65 years and older on average need about 3 times as more health care than the young healthy individual. We take a closer look at some of the official figures relevant to South Africa. I do have some transparencies, but I think it'll be easier and quicker if I rather refer you to the copy of my text, which you should have in front of you. It's on page 4. We look at first of all, the total population of South Africa. It may be common knowledge to many of us, but briefly just, in 1980 it was 23.6 million people. This is to grow to about 45 million in the year 2000, which means virtually a doubling. And then again to between 58 and 68 million in the year 2020. It's a lot of people that will be added to the population. If you look at the projected percentage growth per population group, you can see that for the black population group, the increase from 1980 to 2000 will be as much as anything between 112 to 120%, whereas for whites it will be 33%, and for colored and Asians about 40%. and the other figures for the years 1980 to 2020 are also supplied. Looking at the average age of the population, we see that the percentage increase in life expectancy at birth for 1970 versus 1980 has in all instances shown quite a real increase. For the black population group, a black baby born in 1970 would have had, if he was a male, a life expectancy of 49, and by the year 1980, this life expectancy will be 55, an increase of 12.2%. For coloreds, it's even more severe, from 49 years to 56 years, a percentage increase of 15.2% for the males. So I supply the other figures as well. It's easy to see that the average age of the population is getting much higher. The third set of figures there, the projected population of 65 years and older for South Africa. In 1980, it was only 1,087,000 people. But this figure is to rise, according to official figures, from the Human Sciences Research Council to 3,805 million. And if you divide this into population groups and then give it as a percentage increase, you can see the figures of really impressive nature. Blacks, 292% increase of people of the age of 65 and older in the country. Whites, 142%, coloreds, 322% more, and Asians, 514% more aged members of the population group. In total, an average rise of 250%. The conclusion based on this, of course, is that the demand for healthcare will increase dramatically in the following few decades, with or without privatization. Now let's look at the supply side of the hospital facilities. In South Africa, this has traditionally been entrusted to the government. If one classifies a private hospital as a hospital where doctors in private practice can admit and operate on patients belonging to various medical aid schemes, the amount of private hospital beds in South Africa varies from about 5% to an absolute maximum of 15% of total beds in the different provinces. At present, the figure is very close to 5%. It may reach 10%, 15% is unlikely for the next couple of years. Now, I must state here that obtaining clear and correct figures for healthcare in South Africa is rather difficult. There are many good and bad reasons for this, but it is generally accepted that it is the case. Let us look closer at some of the more important and correct figures. The government expenditure as percentage of the gross domestic product, at present it's 30% of the 100 billion. This is the highest it has ever been. It is highly unlikely that it will be increased intentionally and substantially. However, if it is, health will have to fall in line behind other priorities like education, defense, and repayment of overseas loans. And this fact has already been demonstrated in the recent budget, where expenditure on education and defense was increased by 19% each, whereas for health it was only increased by 10%. The percentage of the GDP spent on health in 1980-81 it was 4.6%, and 84-85 it rose to 5.4%. In the United States of America, this figure amounts to 11%, projected to increase to 12% by the year 1990. In most Western countries, a figure of about 8 to 10% is accepted as reasonable. So according to Western standards, South Africa therefore has the potential to spend much more on health care. But if this is to happen, the private sector will have to play the major role. An interesting set of figures, the income and expenditure of the Cape Provincial Administration on health services. Remember that the provincial administrations paid and organized the health services, or by far the majority of it, up to the new dispensation. These figures are from the hospital yearbook, and you can see there that in 1982, the interesting figure to look at is, of course, the expenditure side. What is included under expenditure is not clear, and how they derive the figures is not clear as well, but these are the official figures published. So they spent in 1982 434 million, and that increased year by year to a figure of 765 million in 1985. One can see that the percentage increase In those years were 1982-83, 22.6%, and then the next year 17.6%, and the last year, latest figures, 22.3%. These figures are all substantially higher than the average inflation rate for those years. Furthermore, it happened when the provincial administration was already running its hospitals on strict cost containment measures. During November 1985, they, for instance, declared publicly on the front pages of Cape newspapers that the Tygerberg Hospital, that's the teaching hospital of the Stellenbosch Medical School, was in a serious financial crisis and that it would have to curtail services to patients unless more money was found. Nevertheless, expenditure still rose by 22.3% according to the official figure. The conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, of course, that the need for facilities will rise dramatically. And secondly, that the government money for expenditure on health services is just not available. Let's look at the logical alternative for the government if they don't have the money available. Members of medical aid schemes pay privately for their health care unless they are admitted to public hospitals where the money of taxpayers subsidizes them. As in all other countries with private health services, this can be pretty expensive for the individual. Notwithstanding the cost, though, patients tend to prefer private and individualized medical care. The nearly 50% of doctors in private practice in South Africa, that's about 10,000 of the nearly 20,000, underlines this fact. Patients accept that medical care is expensive. As long as they are not ripped off, they are willing to pay for services, especially in a prepaid form like a medical aid scheme. The health care of any family is high on its budget priority list and is not easily cut. And the membership statistics for medical aid schemes support this. On page 7, the figures of the medical aid scheme beneficiaries are given. You can see that in 1980, 73.6% of the white population belonged to medical aids, whereas only 2.1% of the black population belonged to medical aids. In total, 18.3% of the population belonged to medical aids. That is 4,329,000 people. In 1983, this figure increased the total to 5,000,054, and the percentage of the total population from 18.3% to 19.8%. You can see that the rise. The interesting figure to look at, of course, is, for instance, in the black population group, where you had 2.1% of people in 1980 belonging to medical aids, the percentage increase, as percentage of the population, this figure increased in 1983 to 3.6, but the absolute number of people very nearly doubled. And you can see that the percentage increase of beneficiaries in 1980 to 1983 for whites was 10.3%, coloreds 13.9%, blacks 83.2%, Asians 15%, and in total 16.8%. It can be accepted that membership figures grew at the same or probably an even higher rate for 1983 to 1985, but the figures for those in later years are not yet available from the Registrar of Medical Schemes. Looking at these figures, it is easy to see that the government can substantially reduce its health bill if it does not subsidize these patients, and if it encourages people to belong to medical aid schemes. The present medical aid scheme movement is, however, far from perfect and will have to adjust in a number of ways. I should give a number of suggested improvements for medical aid schemes, and this is based, I think the health industry can take some pride that they at this stage already have come together, all facets, nursing, doctors, dentists, hospital people, pharmaceutical people, and we have drawn up a report which has been submitted to Dr. Wim de Villiers' committee under Minister Ililo, exactly on how we see possibilities to privatize health care. There were 4 subcommittees, and the final committee report under the chairmanship of Dr. Snakers has been handed to Dr. Watermeyer, who then took it to the official bodies. These suggested improvements for medical aid schemes come from this report. The whole medical aid industry should become more like the insurance industry. Various packages should be offered to various clients. Not everybody wants or needs 5-star treatment, but those that want it must be sure that they will get it. Flexibility to suit the demands of the customers or the clients should be the key to provisions like, for instance, no claim bonuses, catastrophic cover only, payment of certain percentages of an account only, inclusion or exclusion of certain services, for instance, traditional doctors in the black communities, extra cover for aspects like preventative medicine or home care or related medical services, and then numerous other possible alternatives. In the hospital world, this should of course also lead to a system of accreditation of hospitals for tariff purposes. At this stage, ladies and gentlemen, all private hospitals charge the same tariff, notwithstanding whether they are 5-star or 1-star. These are for the general wards or general rooms. For their private rooms, they can ask a market-related tariff. The government should actively support this movement by regarding medical aid schemes in a very similar light to pension funds. If patients do not look after themselves in this respect, the government will have to care for them. Therefore, it will pay the government to encourage people to belong to medical aid schemes or even to make it compulsory above a certain income level. I do not see the government selling off any of their present surplus beds in white hospitals to the private sector. Looking at the total picture of beds available for all the population groups, as well as the increasing number of elderly people in the country, the government will only have to build new facilities later on if they sell existing facilities. The government will, for a long, long time, have to cater for the indigent, the chronic ill, the terminally ill, the frail and aged, and those members of medical aid schemes whose limits have been exceeded. What I do see, management contracts with the private sector, as well as the farming out of supportive services like laundry, cleaning, gardening, and so forth. I also see the provision of segments of healthcare, like for instance casualty clinics or preventative medicine clinics, being farmed out to the private sector, and then with the capitation funding that Mr. Davis has mentioned here. In other words, the government paying for the patient and not for the hospital. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the government can only reduce its financial obligation to healthcare in one of 3 ways. Increased efficiency. It's an ongoing process, but up to now not particularly successful. Even if much more successful, the effect will not be too dramatic, because high quality healthcare remains very expensive to supply. I can refer you to an article in the Harvard Business Review of April 1985, where Professors Aron and Schwartz had an article, Hospital Cost Control, a Bitter Pill to Swallow, where they came to the conclusion that the only permanent way of reducing the cost of hospital care is by reducing the standard of hospital care. The second option, the lowering of standards, an unpopular move, but it will inevitably take place in the absence of other developments. And the last and the logical alternative for me, option for the government, is by shifting off patients to the private sector. This will happen through the workings of medical aid schemes. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, I do not expect this to be popular amongst the tax-paying public. Seeing that they will now have to pay more for their own health care, they should theoretically be paying less tax, and this I cannot see happening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.